Timeless Assassin by author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 901 to 930. Chapter 901 Waiting for the Signal. Meanwhile, aboard a Sioux clan destroyer ship, Su Yang's POV. Shing, shing. Livestream noises. Su Yang sharpened his sword against a whetstone with steady, practiced motions, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filling the quiet between bursts of distorted audio from the execution livestream playing on the holoscreen in front of him, as sparks flashed briefly with each pass and faded just as quickly, mirroring the tension building in his chest while Soren's image flickered across the projection. The blade was already sharp enough to split hair, yet he kept going anyway, more out of habit than necessity, as his eyes remained fixed on the screen where gods exchanged words meant to shake the universe, while his hands moved on instinct alone, grounding him in something simple and familiar. I still can't believe what I'm seeing. Su Yang muttered under his breath, the whetstone slowing slightly as his brows drew together. To think that the righteous faction would pull security from multiple resource-rich worlds just to stage a spectacle like this, all because they were convinced the cult needed to be crushed publicly rather than quietly. He exhaled through his nose. It's reckless, arrogant, and for once, that arrogance is working in our favor. He finally paused, lifting the blade to inspect its edge, before setting both sword and stone aside as his attention shifted fully to the larger picture forming in his mind. A planet like Notum doesn't stay exposed for long. Everyone knows what it holds. Mana stones, rare alloys, natural circuit amplifiers, resources that can empower a clan for generations if secured properly. His fingers curled slowly. This is the kind of opening that changes a clan's destiny, he said, as behind him, Su Tang's presence remained calm and unmoving, the clan patriarch seated with his hands folded loosely as he watched both his son and the livestream with equal scrutiny, his expression unreadable. You're not wrong in your assessment, son, Su Tang said at last, his voice low and deliberate. But you're still not seeing the full picture. You're thinking as a warrior, when what you need to learn is to think like the next patriarch. Su Tang guided, as Su Yang raised an eyebrow at his words. What you're witnessing on that screen isn't just an execution that doesn't affect the Su clan. It's a turning point, and what comes off it will surely have grave consequences for us as well. Su Tang said, as he leaned forward just enough to rest his forearms against the table. If the cult collapses as a credible threat today, the righteous faction will need something else to point at, something else to unify against, and the Su clan will then become the universe's next big villains. There was no accusation in his tone, only warning. So yes, Notum is ripe. The timing is excellent, and today may very well strengthen the Su clan's foundation. A brief pause followed. But do not confuse opportunity with safety, or momentum with inevitability. For power gained during chaos is always examined more harshly once order returns. Su Tang guided patiently, as Su Yang finally nodded in quiet understanding, his inexperienced mind beginning to grasp the broader picture for the first time, as he realized that he had been watching the livestream from the wrong perspective altogether. Until now, every glance at the broadcast had filled him with nothing but excitement, focused solely on the fact that many of the righteous faction's strongest commanders and warriors were gathered on the pit instead of guarding their home worlds. And while that absence did make those planets easier targets in the present, what he had failed to account for was the future that followed such a move. Because while today looked bright for the Su clan, tomorrow, as his father had pointed out, remained uncertain at best. The Su clan was poised to raid, loot and destroy 9 righteous faction planets today, in hopes that the accumulated wealth would sustain their society for many centuries to come. However, depending on the outcome of today's war on the pit, their move today was either to go unnoticed, or brand them as the next big villains of the universe. Meanwhile, on planet Ixtal, Leo's POV. Leo stood at the front of the command chamber, shoulders squared and back straight, his gaze fixed on the massive livestream projection hovering in the air before him, as the shifting light from the pit washed across his face and reflected faintly in his eyes. He barely blinked. Around him, the cult commanders stood in formation, their presence heavy but disciplined, yet Leo did not turn to acknowledge them, as his focus remained anchored to a single figure on the screen, as he watched every minute change in Soren's posture, every pause between his words, every fraction of movement that could potentially carry meaning beyond what was spoken aloud. Not yet. The thought surfaced quietly, controlled, as his fingers curled slowly into his palms and then tightened further, the tension grounding. Rather than overwhelming him, Soren hasn't given the signal yet. He shifted his weight slightly, jaw setting as his eyes tracked the exchange unfolding on the livestream, his mind replaying every plan they had prepared in advance, every route plotted through hostile space, every fleet positioned just beyond detection, all of it balanced. On the edge of activation. This was the part Leo hated. The waiting, not because he doubted the plan, but because he understood the cost of mistiming it, as moving even a moment too early or late would ruin everything. He's buying time, Leo thought, as his gaze hardened, the realization settling in with certainty rather than panic, as Leo recognized the deliberate pacing in Soren's words, the way he held attention without escalating and the way he refused to be drawn into a premature clash. Huff. Leo exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his grip to loosen just enough to keep control, as he reminded himself that Soren had survived worse than this and that he had endured centuries of decay, betrayal, and pursuit without breaking. Behind him, no one spoke, yet Leo could feel the readiness in the room, the restrained hunger for motion that mirrored his own, as every commander waited for the same thing he was waiting for. One signal, one confirmation. One moment where restraint would no longer serve them. Leo leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as the livestream continued, his attention sharpening rather than wavering. When it comes, his fingers flexed once. I won't hesitate. Because the instant Soren gave the signal, the cult would march to his rescue. Chapter 902 The Start. Execution livestream continuation, The Pit. The momentary stillness that followed Soren's exchange with Kalith did not last long. For Helmuth had never been a god built for patience, nor one inclined to tolerate silence when bloodshed remained pending. Hence, at the first opportunity that presented itself, he stepped forward deliberately, boots grinding against the stone of the execution platform as the heat radiating from his body intensified. Ha ha ha, he chuckled, the air around him warping visibly as if scorched by proximity alone, his broad shoulders rolling once as he adjusted his grip on the massive battle axe resting against his back. All right, Helmuth said at last, his voice carrying with it a raw, abrasive edge that cut cleanly through the tension. I've waited long enough for you two brothers to finish your chatter. He reached back and tore the axe free in a single fluid motion, the weapon screaming as it cleaved through the air before he brought it forward and leveled its edge directly at Soren, the blade glowing faintly as heat bled from its surface. Now it's time for you to fight me one-on-one like a man, Soren. The declaration echoed across the execution grounds and spilled outward through the livestream, as Helmuth's expression twisted further into something feral, veins standing out along his neck while the inferno-like aura pouring from his body intensified, heat rolling outward in oppressive waves that forced lesser beings to instinctively step back. Soren did not flinch. He remained where he stood, posture relaxed, gaze steady, as though Helmuth's eruption was little more than noise, his eyes drifting lazily from the axe to the god wielding it. Just you? Soren asked calmly, his tone almost curious, as he tilted his head slightly. Are you sure? His gaze shifted briefly, sliding toward Kalith first, then toward Morris lounging comfortably on his throne, before returning to Helmuth with a faint glint of amusement, as the berserker's lips curled upward in response. I've wanted to prove this for a long time now, Helmuth said, his voice rising as his chest expanded and his aura flared brighter. That it's me, Helmuth, the god of berserkers, who stands as the greatest warrior to ever live in the history of the universe. He took another step forward, axe dragging briefly against the stone, sparks flying as the blade scraped a shallow groove into the platform. Not you, he continued, pointing the weapon toward Soren. Not your father, the so-called timeless assassin. His grin widened into something unhinged. But me. He straightened fully, spreading his arms slightly as the heat around him surged. I am the strongest. The declaration rang out with absolute conviction, the kind that came not from doubt, but from obsession honed over countless wars. For a brief moment, the platform remained silent. Then Soren snorted. As comically enough, at the exact same time, Kalith did as well. The sound was small, almost dismissive, yet the shared reaction drew attention instantly, the two brothers exchanging no glance at all as their mirrored expressions conveyed the same unspoken thought, that Helmuth even daring to place himself beside their father bordered on absurdity. Morris laughed. Ha ha ha, the Chaos God chuckled, leaning back against his throne as he clasped his hands together with theatrical delight. This should be fun. He shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other as his eyes gleamed with interest. If only I had my maid servants here to feed me peeled grapes, then it would have been perfect, Morris continued, sighing exaggeratedly. Still, this is not bad either. He leaned forward just enough for his presence to press subtly against the sealed space. I will respect Helmuth's wishes and refrain from interfering in this little duel, he said lightly, lifting a finger. However, I have a condition. His smile sharpened. The victor must allow me to drag away the corpse of the dead god. Morris said without hesitation, for I have certain desires, and a few experiments, that I would very much like to conduct. Both Helmuth and Soren shot him identical looks, sharp and warning, before their attention returned to one another, neither offering Morris the satisfaction of a reply. Soren exhaled slowly. His shoulders rolled once, then twice, as he reached up and cracked his neck with a soft series of pops, the sound carrying faintly in the silence that followed, before his hands moved toward his waist. With unhurried motions, he drew a pair of long daggers free. Not the Grudgekeeper set. Just his usual blades. Simple in design, dark in color, their edges clean but unremarkable at first glance, lacking the unmistakable aura of origin metal that gods had come to associate with weapons meant to kill their kind. Helmuth's eyes narrowed. So did Calith's. Even Morris leaned forward slightly, curiosity sharpening as all three inspected the weapons in Soren's hands. Not origin metal. The realization struck them almost simultaneously. A faint ripple of surprise passed between them, for a normal blade, no matter how well crafted, could not permanently harm a god, its effectiveness fading rapidly against divine regeneration, making its use in such a fight almost laughable. Helmuth mused, as he let out a low, incredulous laugh. Do you not have an origin metal blade on you, cult master? He asked, his tone carrying a hint of offense beneath the mockery. Or do you simply believe I am not worthy enough for you to draw one? He asked sarcastically, as Soren's lips curved upward. The smile was slow, deliberate. Of course it's the latter, Soren replied evenly, his eyes never leaving Helmuth's. You berserker weakling. He mocked, as the words landed cleanly, and Helmuth's expression snapped. The heat around him exploded outward as his aura surged violently. The stone beneath his feet cracking in jagged lines as he threw his head back and roared, the sound raw and primal, stripped of reason. Arg, that's it. You're a dead man, he declared before lunging forward, as he brought the axe down in a blazing arc, the inferno surrounding him compressing into focused fury as he closed the distance in a heartbeat, his intent to kill clear and singular. Step. Soren shifted his stance. Daggers lowered, eyes sharp, and as Helmuth's charge tore across the execution platform, the livestream froze on the brink of collision, billions across the universe holding their breath as the first blow of a battle between gods finally began. Chapter 903 Helmuth vs. Soren 1. Execution livestream continuation, The Pit. Helmuth closed the distance in a heartbeat, the inferno around him compressing into a tight, violent sheath that allowed his battle axe to come down with the kind of flurry that made mortals flinch even when they were safely behind shields. Arghhh. He roared, as the livestream arrays struggled to keep his movement coherent, frames stuttering as though the cameras themselves could not agree on where he was. However, despite his barbaric charge, Soren did not retreat. He simply shifted one foot, as though stepping aside for a passerby, while his shoulders rotated a fraction late and a fraction early at the same time, as he allowed the axe to descend into stone that cracked only after the blade had already passed through it, the sound arriving half a beat delayed as if reality needed an extra moment to accept what had been done to it. Crack. The first blow should have ended it. That was what the crowd thought, as they watched Helmuth's weapon carve straight down through the execution platform with a clean, brutal line, while Soren's figure seemed to dissolve into the air beside it, and for an instant it looked like the cult god had been split and erased. Yet the next instant rewrote that perception. Soren was standing a step to the side, both daggers already drawn, their edges held low and quiet, as though he had never moved at all, while Helmuth's axe bit so deep into the platform that the haft vibrated, and heat bled into the cracks like liquid fire. THRUMM. FSHHHH. No one could explain it. The mortals in the outer rings could not even track the transition, as their eyes simply jumped from, Soren is there, to, Soren is not there, to, Soren is there again, while Monarch tier commanders grimaced in confusion because they could see the movement, yet their minds refused to accept the order in which it happened. Ha ha ha, good one. Morris laughed under his breath, not because it was funny, but because it was satisfying, as he watched Helmuth tear the axe free with a single violent pull and swing it again without resetting his stance, the weapon reversing direction in the middle of its own follow-through, as momentum bent unnaturally as if the axe had decided to follow its own path. Swoosh! Soren stepped inside that second swing. Not toward Helmuth's body, but rather toward the gap created by Helmuth's choice to attack. Stab slash. His daggers rose in a mirrored motion that looked simple, almost clean, as the left blade angled toward Helmuth's ribs and the right blade angled toward the exposed line of his throat, while the berserker god snarled and twisted, his shoulder rolling forward and his neck dipping just enough to close those angles. Swoosh, swoosh. The blades did not land. They could not. Instead, they skimmed close enough that the air screamed, as edges passed through heat, aura and a thin layer of divine resistance that felt like striking invisible glass, while Soren used that resistance like a foothold, letting it redirect his motion into something sharper. To the crowd, it looked like he had slipped through Helmuth. While to the gods, it looked like Soren had threaded a needle that did not exist. Arghhhh. Helmuth screamed as he spun, heat exploding outward in a thick wave meant to shove Soren away and force distance, as he refused to let a dagger user live inside his blind zone. However, in his attempt to shove Soren away, he instinctively tried to step into the fourth dimension, his aura pushing against the boundaries of the three-dimensional world, as the Chakravya formation instantly reverberated in response. Truusshhhh. Asterisk. Despite the strong pressure, the Chakravya refused to break, the fourth-dimensional lock remaining intact, as the flow of time remained linear. However, since it did not break, the aura concentration within the inner circle only became that much more intense as it ensured that every ounce of killing intent had nowhere to escape, except into pressure, into impact and into the thin layer of reality forced to hold four gods inside a fixed frame. Yet, despite Helmuth's best attempts, Soren did not get shoved back under his pressure, as the cult god glided through his defense. Instead, step step step, he moved the way a shadow would move if it decided to become sharp, as he rotated around Helmuth's flank and made three small steps that should have been ordinary, except each step occurred in a place his body should not have reached without crossing the space between, while Helmuth's axe continued swinging, tracing brutal arcs designed to cut away any path Soren might take, only to find nothing there. Swoosh asterisk swoosh asterisk swoosh. The arcs overlapped. They covered every escape route. And still Soren remained uncut. Not because he was faster. Because he was choosing where the fight existed. Clarence felt his scalp tighten as he watched the fight unfold. Because although the Chakravya had pinned them to three dimensions, Soren and Helmuth seemed to be fighting as if they were arguing with the definition of three itself, while Terence's posture stiffened subtly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to track angles that refused to remain angles. Calith's gaze stayed steady. He did not react outwardly, yet the slightest tension gathered in his eyes, as if he were measuring Soren's decay against Soren's control and finding the comparison unpleasantly complicated. He doesn't look like he's slowed down a beat. He's not as sharp as he used to be back when father used to spar against us every day. Yet, he's not terribly slow either. I expected him to be moving a lot worse than he is right now, however, it seems like I overestimated the level of decay his body has suffered. If he can move this way, then he has more than a fight left in him for sure. Calith concluded, as he continued to watch the fight unfold with bated breaths, while also wondering whether or not he should interfere and deliver a critical blow in the middle of it all. Chapter 904 Helmuth vs. Soren 2. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. The clash did not pause. It simply shifted shape. Helmuth did not give Soren time to reset, to breathe, or to reframe the exchange that had just slipped through his fingers, as the berserker god twisted his grip and surged forward again with renewed violence, his aura tightening instead of flaring, heat drawn inward rather than expelled, as this time, he did not swing, but rather thrust. Jab. The axe came forward like a spear, the blade angled to hook and tear, as Helmuth dipped his shoulders and committed his entire mass behind the weapon, turning himself into a living projectile as he drove the edge toward Soren's chest with the intent to pin him to stone and split him open in a single decisive motion. To which, Soren's daggers rose in a cross, with the intent not being to block, but rather to redirect. Ching! Soren caught the axe head between the two blades without letting metal truly touch, divine pressure compressing between them like a locked jaw, as he twisted his wrists and slid the weapon aside by a fraction that should not have mattered, yet in a fight at this level, that fraction rewrote the outcome entirely. Swoosh! Helmuth's thrust missed. Not by inches. By a decision. The axe passed Soren's ribs close enough that the heat peeled fabric away, yet Soren moved with the weapon rather than away from it, staying attached to its line as though he had been dragged, and in that same motion he stepped behind Helmuth's shoulder. Gasp! Scream! The crowd collectively screamed again, because to them Soren had vanished and reappeared in the wrong place, the motion looking like something that spelled an assured death for Helmuth. Yet Helmuth did not die. Helmuth laughed. Na-na-na-na. The sound punched through the confusion, raw and delighted, as the berserker god bent backward at an angle that should have snapped his spine, his body folding just enough to ruin Soren's line, while his free hand reached back and closed around empty air. Except it wasn't empty. Clutch. His hand snapped shut around Soren's wrist, as for the first time, contact was made. Not flesh on flesh, aura on aura, as Soren found himself caught in a vice made of heat and will. I've got you now, cult master. Helmuth taunted. However, Soren did not panic at all, his hand hovering a single hair away from Helmuth's throat, as the blade trembled faintly under pressure. Push asterisk. Both gods pushed against one another with all their strength, as the platform seemed to freeze. A single locked wrist, a single halted dagger, a single breath where one god had prevented another from completing an action. Soren's gaze sharpened, Helmuth's grin widened. Then Soren let go of the dagger. Not by dropping it, but rather by rotating his fingers in a way that made the weapon spin through Helmuth's grip line without moving through space, as the dagger flipped end over end, allowing his hand to escape from Helmuth's hold, as he recaught the hilt from a new angle, while Helmuth's grasp snapped shut on nothing again, as he moved a tad bit too late. Clap, clap. Morris began clapping, slow, mocking, as though applauding a performance. While Helmuth snapped his head to the side and spat a breath of heat, irritation flickering across his expression, yet his attention never truly left Soren, because the berserker god could feel it now, the razor-thin line separating dominance from humiliation. He surged forward again. No cleverness. No restraint. Just raw combat. The axe rose and fell in brutal rhythm, each swing faster than the last. As Helmuth tried to drown Soren in inevitability, as he tried to make the field of motion so dense that no amount of precision could slip through. However, Soren answered by becoming smaller. Not physically. Tactically. As he reduced his movement to minimal shifts, conserving distance. Like it was oxygen, while his daggers traced thin lines through the air that were not attacks yet, but calibrations, as he measured Helmuth's timing, tested his reach, and mapped the microscopic delays between his intent and execution. To most viewers, it looked like Soren was barely moving. To those who could truly see, it looked like Soren was moving too much to be real. There were moments where Helmuth's axe passed through Soren's space, and Soren was still there afterward, unchanged. In moments where Soren's daggers flickered toward Helmuth's throat, and Helmuth remained whole, untouched, as though the universe itself refused to grant either of them the satisfaction of a first true wound inside this cage. Then Helmuth changed again. He stopped chasing. He started waiting. He planted his feet, axe held low and ready, heat simmering instead of exploding, his eyes tracking Soren with a predator's calm that looked wrong on a berserker, as though rage had learned patience for the sake of killing. Soren noticed. His shoulders lowered a fraction. His steps slowed. His daggers tilted inward. The first phase ended without a decisive strike, yet the air felt heavier than before, because now both gods were reading each other properly, and the next exchange would not be chaotic. It would be clean. It would be intentional. Across the universe, trillions held their breath again, not because a blow had landed, but because none had, as even the most distant viewers could feel that the fight was finally beginning to make sense to the combatants, even while remaining incomprehensible to everyone else. And as Helmuth lifted his axe once more, and Soren adjusted his grip. Without taking a step, Soren muttered a phrase that made sense to no one but Leo, who he knew would be watching from back on Ixtal. "Why don't you try this on for size?" Soren said, as back on Ixtal, Leo felt goosebumps arise on his skin the second he heard those words, as he instantly jumped to his feet and gave a nod to his commanders that it was time to march. Chapter 905 Opening the Tunnel. Meanwhile, on planet Ixtal, Leo's POV. "Why don't you try this on for size?" The moment those words reached him through the livestream, goosebumps spread across Leo's skin as his breath caught for a fraction of a second, not because he was startled or uncertain, but because something deep inside him had already recognized the intent behind them, as though Soren had reached across space itself and pressed a switch that had been waiting to be flipped. "That's the signal," Leo thought as he straightened immediately, the tension in his shoulders shifting into controlled readiness as his body responded faster than conscious thought, his hand clenching once before relaxing as his gaze hardened and his posture changed just enough for the cult commanders around him to notice. No orders were spoken. They did not need to be. The moment Leo turned and walked away from the projection, the command chamber erupted into motion behind him, not through panic or noise, but through practiced efficiency. As relays lit up, officers snapped into position, and deployment sequences that had been prepared long in advance finally crossed the threshold from planning to execution. Step, step, step. Leo did not look back. As he moved, his mind shifted away from Soren's words and onto the path that connected Ixtal to the pit, the ancient tunneling map Multheric had entrusted to him, unfolding in his thoughts as he recalled the exact vector he needed to follow to reach it. 24.24 degrees. He had already calculated it from the ancient map days ago, knowing with that Isai's orientation, he would reach the pit after an arduous journey of roughly 15 minutes spent inside the dimensional tunnel. "Can't make any mistakes now, or billions of lives will be doomed alongside me," he thought as he scanned the wide plains outside the command station. Plains where the cult army was already in motion. Across the horizon, soldiers streamed toward their assigned transports in disciplined waves as commanders shouted final confirmations, destroyers lifting from the ground one by one as engines roared to life, their undersides glowing as anti-gravity fields engaged, while frigates and carriers adjusted altitude and spacing in preparation for immediate departure. Leo walked through the center of it all, his presence cutting a clean line through motion and noise alike, as pilots straightened instinctively when he passed. "Pilots, you can make no mistakes today," Leo had told them during a private briefing hours earlier, when he had shaken hands with every cult pilot manning an aircraft, reminding them of the importance of precise timing and absolute accuracy during this dangerous journey through the fourth dimension. Huff. Letting out a deep breath, Leo stopped at the edge of the plains, where the ground dipped slightly and the air felt thinner, as he closed his eyes and raised his hand. Slash. He cut through empty air, tracing a narrow line with controlled precision as he began committing the entry angle to muscle memory before opening the tunnel. That was precisely 24.24 degrees. He thought, before slashing again, and again, and again, until he felt assured that each cut followed the same arc, the same orientation, and the same angle, without requiring conscious correction. 24.24. He confirmed once more before opening his eyes, as he spread his aura thin while probing for dimensional weaknesses in his surroundings. A few seconds passed. Then he sensed it. A faint distortion. There it is, he thought, as he stepped forward and conjured an aura dagger before cutting open a dimensional tunnel with it without hesitation. Slash. FSHHHH. Reality split. Colors bled into one another as the dimensional tunnel tore open, wind snapping erratically as space refused to settle into depth or distance, the opening barely wide enough for a single human body as the edges trembled under strain. "I've done it. I've opened the tunnel, but I need to widen it so the Army's jets can pass. And for that, I need Multherac's orb," Leo thought as he reached into his storage ring and withdrew the aura orb Multheric had given him a few weeks ago. Even sealed, it pressed against his senses like a coiled storm. "I need 15 minutes. Just 15. Let's hope I can withstand his pressure for that long," he prayed, as he layered a thick aura shield around himself methodically, one layer after another, before cracking the orb open, as he unleashed the ancient dragon's aura. Thrum. Tremble. Violent aura surged outward in a chaotic wave, slamming into the Tunnel's boundaries as reality groaned under the pressure, the opening widening rapidly as brute force replaced finesse, causing the ground below Leo's feet to shake. Wobble. Leo felt his knees weaken as the pressure crashed into him, his vision swimming as blood surged up his throat. Shit, I'm fucked, Leo thought, as he forcibly bit the blood back down hard and pushed his body to obey his will. So this is Molthorak's true power. Leo realized, as he felt the true power of a tyrant's killing intent compressed into a small sphere. Take this orb, boy, and crush it just before you enter the dimensional tunnel. While your aura is not strong enough to let an army pass through, mine is. So as long as you can endure my pressure, one orb should allow you and your army to safely pass to your destination. Molthorak had told him when he handed him the orb. However, it seemed to be a simpler plan back then than now. Too strong, it's too strong, Leo thought, as he realized just how impossible a task it was for him to withstand this insane pressure for 15 straight minutes, but even so, he gathered his resolve and stepped forward, knowing well that failure at this stage was not an option. Step. Slowly, deliberately, he entered the dimensional tunnel, the rift expanding further as it swallowed the chaotic orb whole. FSHHHHHHH. Asterisk. Tremble. Now resembling a massive tear in space, the tunnel widened enough to accommodate ships as the distortion settled into something barely stable, the air vibrating as though reality itself were holding its breath. Pilots, Leo said quietly, his voice carrying instantly through intercom relays across the plains. Follow me in. Now, he commanded, as the destroyers aligned first, their hulls sliding into position with precise spacing as frigates followed, carriers adjusting altitude and orientation behind them, engines roaring in synchronized bursts as the fleet formed a single file line aimed directly at the tunnel. One by one, the ships followed Leo into the rift, vanishing into warped space as the cult army finally moved, leaving Ixtal behind as they marched toward the pit, toward a battle between gods, and toward saving their dragon, Aegon Ver. Their god and sect master had called for aid, and the shadow dragon had answered. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 911 Losing Consciousness. Meanwhile, Leo's paw, a minutes earlier. By the time Leo felt the resistance thin, he could no longer tell whether that sensation was real or simply something his mind had invented to justify continuing forward, because although his body had long since stopped feeling like something he truly inhabited, reduced instead to delayed echoes of intent and motion, his will still seemed to be issuing commands to a vessel that had not yet fully collapsed. Light appeared ahead of him. Or at least, he thought it did. It bled into the tunnel gradually, not as a clean opening or a defined destination, but as a pale intrusion that cut through the distortion in uneven waves, flickering and stretching as though unsure whether it was permitted to exist here at all, and Leo's heart stuttered painfully at the sight as hope and suspicion tangled together until neither could be trusted. Is that it? The thought barely formed, weak and slurred, as his vision swam violently and the tunnel groaned around him, reality creaking like an overstrained hinge while Molthorak's aura continued to pour through his body unchecked, no longer something he directed or shaped, but something that used him as a conduit simply because he no longer had the strength left to resist it. Step. He took a couple steps. Or maybe he was pushed. The distinction no longer mattered. All that mattered was that he kept moving, because stopping had ceased to be an option long ago, and even as the tunnel thinned and the pressure shifted, his instinct screamed at him not to slow down, not to hesitate, not to trust the light until he had torn the path open completely. And so, he lifted his arm again. Not with intention, not with precision, but with memory. The motion came from somewhere deeper than thought, 24.24 degrees etched so deeply into his body that even now, even in this half-lucid state where sensation and hallucination blurred together, the angle remained perfect, the slash carving forward through the last resistance with brutal inevitability. FSHHHH. The dimensional wall ruptured. Space screaming as the final barrier collapsed under the compounded force of Molthorak's remaining aura, the tunnel exploding outward into blinding light as the fourth dimension disgorged itself violently into three-dimensional space, reality snapping back into alignment with a thunderous distortion that sent shockwaves rippling in every direction. Step. Leo stumbled forward. Or rather, he walked straight through it. His boots striking solid ground. Stone. Cold. Real. Yet even then, certainty refused to return. Because although he felt the difference beneath his feet, although the distortion thinned and the pressure changed, his mind could not accept that the journey was over, his thoughts lagging behind events as he continued to push forward automatically, or still pouring outward because he did not know how to stop it anymore. Keep going. The command surfaced again, hollow and detached. Don't let it collapse, his mind said, as he raised the aura dagger again and slashed. Slash. But this time, there was no tunnel to widen. No corridor to stabilize. No distortion to absorb the force. The aura had nowhere left to go. So it went outward. Molthorax condensed killing intent, compressed and redirected for 15 unbroken minutes, exploded from Leo's body in a silent, invisible wave that rolled across the outer edge of the Chakravia formation like an extinction event, space itself trembling as the pressure erased resistance rather than colliding with it. 25 million lives ended in an instant. Not with screams. Not with resistance. They simply ceased. Soldiers manning the outermost arrays collapsed where they stood, bodies dropping as though the concept of life had been revoked. Mid-thought, sigils flickering violently before shattering outright as the formation lost an entire section of its living anchor points. Leo did not see it. He did not register it. He only felt a brief easing of pressure, a momentary lightness that convinced his fractured mind that the tunnel had finally stabilized, that the danger had passed, and that continuing forward was still the correct choice. Behind him, the world erupted. Cult destroyers burst through the still roaring rift in rapid succession, engines screaming as they cleared the distortion and immediately split formation, weapon systems lighting up as they identified hostile positions and began firing without hesitation, energy lances ripping into disorganized enemy lines while additional ships surged out in waves. Some pushed forward into battle. Others dropped altitude sharply and landed hard around Leo's position, hulls slamming into stone in a protective ring as shields flared to life, creating a temporary barrier that cut off sightlines and blocked the cameras scrambling to reacquire the scene. Inside that ring, Leo finally faltered. The light dimmed. The pressure vanished. And without it, there was nothing left holding him upright. Thud. His knees buckled, not violently, but as though they had been waiting patiently for permission to fail. And once that permission came, Leo collapsed forward onto the stone without ever realizing he was falling, the aura dagger dissolving between his fingers as the final remnants of Molthorax power bled out of the fractured orb within him. Silence rushed in. Not peace. Just absence. His vision darkened completely, thoughts unraveling into nothing as exhaustion finally claimed what the tunnel had not been able to take, consciousness slipping away the moment his body hit the ground. Voices reached him faintly. Distant. Urgent. Healers. Medics. Hands lifting him. Shields tightening. But none of it registered. Because Leo could already feel his consciousness slipping away, his body finally surrendering after carrying an army, a dragon's power, and the weight of an entire war through a dimension that should have killed him 10 times over. And although he knew he could not afford to rest, although he understood that his army still needed him, the truth was unavoidable. At this moment, he needed a few minutes of reprieve, because without it, his mind simply refused to remain conscious any longer, having already supported him far beyond what it was ever meant to endure. Chapter 9:12 Dilemma. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. Across the battlefield, the moment Leo's presence fully registered, the illusion of control fractured in a way no formation, no doctrine, and no amount of preparation could immediately repair, as the righteous monarchs standing at the edge of the command lattice found themselves staring at a reality that simply did not align with any model they had prepared for. Leo Skyshard. Here, on the pit, with an army. For several heartbeats, no one spoke, disbelief rippling through the command strata as eyes traced the still roaring dimensional tunnel and the expanding cult fleet pouring out behind it, because the audacity of the act itself was staggering, an intrusion so brazen and so fundamentally impossible that it took time for even seasoned monarchs to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. How did he get here? One of them muttered grimly, his mind racing through possibilities even as none satisfied the question. Teleportation of this scale should be impossible unless one already made large-scale monoarrays on both ends. However, there were no arrays built here. Then how? Another wondered, as he bit his lip. How did they even fly out of Ixtal unnoticed? We had that planet on lockdown. If anything flew out of Ixtal, we should have known immediately. A third muttered, as the thought broke apart mid-speech as reality refused to comply. This was not infiltration. This was an arrival. And once that truth settled, disbelief gave way to urgency, voices rising sharply as monarchs snapped out orders, hands slashing through holographic displays while they barked commands to stabilize lines, reassign reserves, and reorient formations that had been designed for containment, not sudden invasion. Seal the breach. Hold the outer ring steady. Get casualty counts now. Reinforce the manning arrays before the pressure shifts further inward. They shouted, as the structure held for now, but everyone present could feel it, the subtle redistribution within the Chakravia as millions of lives vanished from its periphery, the burden shifting inward by fractions that were insignificant in isolation, yet ominous in implication. Yet still, on the ground, none of that mattered, for the common soldiers stationed along the outer rings were not thinking about formations or divine logistics, nor did they care about the elegance of the prison they had been ordered to maintain, because all they could see was death arriving without warning, an entire section of their comrades collapsing in silence as if reality itself had simply decided they were no longer necessary. Did you feel that? Someone whispered, voice shaking as he stared at the bodies littering the stone. That wasn't an attack, there was no blast, no light. One moment they were standing fine, the next, dead. Fear spread faster than reason. He killed them just by standing there. Is he already a demigod? No, if that was his aura alone, then what the hell does that make him? The name passed through the righteous ranks like a curse. Leo Skyshard, the demon of Omega, the devil of the cult. It did not matter how disciplined they had been moments earlier, because discipline faltered in the face of something that rewrote the rules of survival. As soldiers stumbled backward, formations loosening as panic bled into instinct, their eyes drawn again and again towards the core of the cult fleet where they knew he stood behind the cover of cult ships. However, they were not the only ones experiencing this phenomenon, as across the universe, the common citizens who had gathered to witness justice unfold found themselves frozen in place, mouths hanging open as certainty crumbled into something raw and desperate, because this was not the spectacle they had been promised. This shouldn't be happening, someone murmured in a crowded plaza, the confidence in their voice gone. The execution was supposed to be swift and fast, not a war. Surely the cult won't actually save that disgusting criminal. There today, right. Surely they've walked to their own graves, right. After all, our best forces are guarding the execution platform. Surely the cult army will quickly be annihilated, right. The words came faster now, overlapping and uncertain, as people leaned closer to their screens, searching for reassurance in the commentators' voices and finding none. Because even the carefully trained presenters had now started to falter, their practiced composure breaking under the weight of the impossible. The narrative was changing in real time. And no one could predict what was coming next. Meanwhile, at the heart of it all, Kalith remained trapped inside the Chakravua's prison, his gaze fixed on the outermost edge of the formation where the cult army continued to pour through, his expression tightening into a genuine frown as calculation steadily displaced instinct. The intrusion itself did not alarm him. In isolation, a mortal fleet meant nothing to a being like him, because erasing such forces had never required effort, intention, or even focus from a god of his standing. Yet the Chakravia made nothing ordinary. Sealed within its interior alongside Helmuth, Morris, and Soren, Kalith found his power turned inward by design rather than choice, his aura bound by a construct that did not allow outward projection, because the prison existed for a single purpose: to ensure that no god trapped inside could influence reality beyond its boundaries, and not even he was beyond that rule. Hence, although he wished for nothing more than to annihilate the ships emerging beyond the barrier, the formation did not permit him to take such an action, for any attempt to force his aura outward was sure to strain the prison's walls, and strained walls risked cracks that Soren could exploit to then escape, in what was the cruel elegance of the Chakravia. Because the God-Killer formation was not merely a cage. It was a system. And the system did not sustain itself from within. It was upheld by the 8 beings anchoring it at its core, and the billions supporting them beyond it in what was a load-sharing mechanism tapping into the strength of one's soul. However, while the restrictions placed on those at the outer rings was negligible, once engaged, the 8 beings powering the formation at its core were also as good as trapped without having any scope of movement, for a shift of even a fraction would destabilize the lattice, and destabilization, however brief, was all Soren would need to escape. Which meant that once again, the only figures capable of responding to the cult's advance were also the ones who could least afford to act. Well played, brother. Well played. So this was your plan all along. Caliph thought, as he gazed towards Helmuth and Soren still fighting like wild dogs near the execution stage. You must trust your army enough to think they can plow through the best soldiers the righteous faction has to offer and reach this formation's core. However, the real question is, can they? Caliph wondered, as he thought about how the Chakravia did not simply lose soldiers when mortals died along its outer rings, but rather lost stabilizers. For the way the formation worked was that every soul powering it acted like a small stabilizer, and when stabilizers vanished, the burden did not disappear, but rather redistributed inward. Meaning that each death kept adding to the strain required to keep the prison sealed from those already holding the structure together. For now, the loss remained manageable. 25 million deaths spread across a construct of this scale, redistributed thinly enough that the 8 at the core could endure the added load without visible consequence. But Caliph did not think in terms of the present. He thought in terms of trajectory. Because if the cult continued advancing inward, if the death toll climbed into the billions and outer rings began failing in contiguous sections rather than scattered gaps, then the weight would shift rapidly toward the center, toward the 8, and at that point, the Chakravia would demand a choice. Either they would risk movement to intercept the cult, gambling on Cracks and Soren's escape, or they would remain immobile and allow the cult army to press inward until it threatened the prison itself. Neither outcome was acceptable, and Caliph could see that inevitability written into the lattice as clearly as law. How did you even manage to bring an army through the 4th dimension, when you are nothing more than a monarch? Caliph wondered, his gaze slipping past the cult destroyers that had landed to block mortal sightlines, before briefly settling on Leo's collapsed form. Irritation tightened in his chest as the implication took hold. Because he knew, with certainty, that even Raymond, as a demigod, could not have accomplished what Leo had achieved as a monarch. Yet it was not Leo's presence that unsettled him to his core. It was the expression on Morris's face. The deceiver watched the unfolding chaos with open delight, his smile widening rather than tightening, as though the cult's arrival had not disrupted his expectations, but fulfilled them. What are you planning now, you snake? Caliph wondered, as the unease that spread within him as he watched Morris was indescribable. Goosebumps traced down his spine, not from fear, but from recognition, from the quiet certainty that whatever bond still existed between him and Morris was beginning to fray. As he felt increasingly certain that the deceiver was beginning to lose his sanity and was slowly but surely leaning towards making decisions catered towards stirring maximum chaos rather than predictable victory. Don't. Whatever you're planning, just don't. Just be normal for once. Caliph prayed, yet even as he prayed for the best, he inevitably began preparing for the worst. Chapter 913 Hope. Execution Livestream Continuation, Ver's POV. For a while after the cult army appeared out of the dimensional portal, Ver did not react at all, his expression frozen as though his mind had simply refused to accept what his eyes were showing him, because hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had already made peace with death. He sat bound upon the execution stage, chains biting into his wrists and ankles as divine restraints hummed softly beneath his skin, while the battlefield beyond the Chakravia erupted into chaos, the arrival of the cult fleet tearing apart the certainty that had wrapped around his fate only minutes ago. They came to save me. He wondered, as that single question struck him harder than any blade ever could. The cult had come. At first, he told himself to stay still, to remain composed, to not give the righteous gods the satisfaction of seeing his resolve waver, because he was the cult dragon, and cult dragons did not break in front of their enemies, not on execution platforms, not beneath the gaze of trillions who wanted nothing more than to see despair reflected in his eyes. His jaw tightened instinctively as he forced the burning pressure behind his eyes back down through sheer discipline, because he had already accepted this end, had already grieved his future in silence, had already carved his own grave in his heart and laid down inside it, with dignity. Yet the battlefield refused to let him stay buried. Explosions thundered across the outer rings. The sky burned with streaks of cult destroyers surging forward. And somewhere out there, beyond the wall of soldiers and sigils and gods, his people were fighting their way through hell for him. For him. The realization cracked something deep inside his chest. His breath hitched once. Then again. His vision blurred as the pressure he had been holding back finally overflowed, tears spilling down his face before he could stop them, shoulders trembling as the weight of it all came crashing down at once, because he had not prepared himself for this. Not for rescue. Not for love. Not for the unbearable cruelty of being given hope after accepting death. I thought I was done, he whispered hoarsely, voice breaking as the words slipped free. He had been an orphan. A nobody. A discarded child who had grown up believing survival was something you earned alone, that love was conditional, fleeting, and always taken away the moment you relied on it. And now this. An army. A fleet. An entire cult tearing its way across the universe for him. Do I even deserve this? He wondered, the thought trembling through him as tears continued to fall unchecked, because all he had ever wanted was to belong, to be wanted without conditions, to be held by something larger than himself without fear of abandonment. And now that he had it, he didn't know how to carry it. His chest ached as he bowed his head slightly, chains rattling softly as emotion poured through him without restraint, 1,000 conflicting feelings crashing together inside him at once. Gratitude and guilt and hope and terror intertwining so tightly that he could barely tell where one ended and another began. But beneath all of it, something else stirred. Something harder. Something sharper. Resolve. His hands clenched against the restraints as his tears slowed, his breathing steadying gradually as he lifted his gaze once more toward the horizon where the cult fleet continued to advance, where Leo had arrived and where the impossible was unfolding in real time. I swear. The vow formed quietly, not as a dramatic declaration, but as something deeply personal, etched into his soul. I swear, if I survive this day. His breath shuddered as he swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay upright despite the tremor still running through his body. I will become the best dragon the cult has ever known. The words settled with weight. I will not make foolish, selfish decisions. I will not let anyone else decide my fate ever again. His gaze sharpened as conviction replaced helplessness, tears drying against his skin as something strong and unyielding took root inside him. If I live through this, if the cult truly saves me today, I will ascend, not as a dream, not as a fantasy, as a promise. I will climb to godhood. I will inherit the will of the timeless assassin. I will return the cult to the glory it once held, no matter what it costs. The battlefield roared in the distance as Ver lifted his face fully now, tears still clinging to his lashes but no longer controlling him as his heart pounded not with fear, but with purpose. He closed his eyes briefly. And prayed, not to the gods who had condemned him, but to the people who were fighting for him. Please, win. Just this once, please win. The righteous faction has kept winning and kept controlling the universe for the better part of over 2 millennia now. Please let this be the start of the reversal, the event that starts the beginning of their downfall and the rise of the cult. For if even after all this we fail today, his thoughts faltered, as he gulped down a mouthful of saliva. If we fail even today, then the cult may be buried here with me. Ver concluded, as his fingers tightened reflexively against the restraints, nails biting into his palms while the battlefield's distant thunder echoed like a heartbeat through his chest. Yet even as that fear lingered, it no longer ruled him. Because whether the cult triumphed or fell here today, he was no longer the same dragon who had been dragged onto this stage in chains, resigned to vanish quietly beneath divine judgment. If this was to be the cult's grave, then he would stand at its center, with his head held high. And if it was to be the moment history turned, then he would live long enough to remember it. But either way, he decided that he would not look away. Come fate, show me what you have in store for me. For I believe in my survival once more, Ver thought, as with tear-blurred eyes fixed on the horizon and his soul burning with fragile, defiant hope, he waited for fate to decide the next chapter of his legend. Chapter 914 The Face-Off. Meanwhile on the pit, within the ring of landed cult ships, Leo's POV Under the direction of senior cult healers and battlefield doctors, Leo was brought inside one of the cult's makeshift medical ships with urgent precision, his unconscious body transferred through sealed corridors and into a reinforced treatment chamber where stabilizing arrays pulsed faintly, their light washing over metal walls etched with emergency runes meant to revive even near-dead soldiers from death. His body was suspended within a cradle of woven mana threads, designed to support fractured circuits and overworked flesh. Yet even within that controlled space, something felt profoundly wrong, as though the chamber itself resisted fully accommodating him. To the untrained eye, he appeared calm, his breathing shallow but present, his expression eerily still, yet the moment the healers drew close, the truth became impossible to ignore, for the lingering remnants of Multhorak's aura had not faded so much as settled inward, smoldering deep within his mana circuits like embers buried beneath collapsed stone. The air around him felt heavier. Denser. Not oppressive in the way killing intent was, but exhausting, as though proximity alone demanded payment. A senior healer reached forward carefully, attempting to introduce a stream of calming restorative mana meant to soothe Leo's inflamed circuits and ease the catastrophic fatigue ravaging his muscles and mind. Yet the moment that energy made contact, it slipped out of alignment entirely, recoiling as if repelled by something far greater than it. The backlash traveled instantly. The healer staggered, breath catching sharply as the feedback surged through his arm and into his core, his vision blurring before his knees finally gave way, forcing nearby attendants to pull him back before he collapsed fully. Another stepped in, reinforcing her mana shield and adjusting her approach, this time targeting Leo's neural pathways in an attempt to stabilize his mind before the accumulated damage could deepen further. Yet she lasted only moments longer, her mana draining uncontrollably the instant it touched him, drawn into the vast deficit within Leo's system like water into a bottomless void. She collapsed without a sound. One after another, they tried. Each time, the result was the same. The lingering dragon aura overwhelmed their control, while the sheer emptiness of Leo's reserves pulled at their mana reflexively, draining them dry before they could sever the connection, leaving seasoned battlefield doctors gasping for breath or slumping unconscious against consoles and bulkheads. Within minutes, the chamber became a quiet disaster. Bodies lay scattered around the treatment room, healers sprawled across the floor or supported against equipment, all alive but spent, victims not of attack, but of proximity, as though Leo himself had become something too heavy for lesser systems to support without consequence. And yet, even then, consciousness did not return to him. Within his mind, there was only distance, a fading echo of pressure held too long and finally released, of motion without certainty, of a task completed without knowing whether it had truly succeeded, as though some part of him still believed he needed to keep moving forward. However, thankfully, while he rested inside, the cult commanders took the mantle of leading the charge, as despite his absence the cult functioned as a well-oiled machine honed for war. Just outside the outer boundary of the Chakravia formation, execution livestream POV. Beyond the ring of landed cult ships, the battlefield stretched outward into a brutal, methodical geometry, as the outermost ring of the Chakravia came fully into view, its vast arc manned by Master-tier soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in dense, regimented blocks, their armor etched with formation sigils that pulsed faintly as they fed small portions of their soul strength into the divine lattice below their feet. They were not elites, nor were they legends, but they were numerous, disciplined, and expendable by design, the weakest layer of a prison that had been constructed to grind down invasions through attrition long before they ever reached its heart. While opposite them, the cult army stood like a storm held barely in check. Billions of soldiers had already landed and taken their positions with mechanical precision, ranks forming and locking into place across the shattered stone as monarchs, transcendents, grand masters, and masters interwove seamlessly into a single cohesive force, their formations built not on rank alone, but on synergy, drilled into them through countless simulations and live fire exercises long before this day had ever arrived. There was no shouting, no chaos, no frantic scrambling for position, only the low hum of readiness rippling through the ranks as weapons shifted in practiced grips, blades angled instinctively, bowstrings pulled taut, and eyes fixed forward with an intensity born not of fear, but of long-contained anticipation. However, that was not all. Behind the infantry lines, the true scale of the cult's preparation revealed itself as colossal war machines were being assembled at terrifying speed, engineers moving with relentless efficiency as siege platforms unfolded, artillery arrays anchored themselves into the stone, and mobile fortresses powered up one after another, their silhouettes rising like iron mountains against the warped sky. While above it all, cult pilots carved lethal patterns through the air, squadrons weaving in overlapping arcs as they continued to rain precision fire into the righteous positions, not to annihilate them outright, but to soften, destabilize, and fracture cohesion, each strike calculated to force reaction without yet committing the full weight of the assault. And through it all, the cult army waited. Restless, yes, but contained. They did not show the feral hunger of an untrained horde, but rather the coiled impatience of warriors who had been preparing for this moment for years, who understood exactly what lay ahead of them, and did not shy away from it. The cult soldiers seemed to understand that this first ring was merely the beginning, that these master-tier enemy soldiers were fodder meant to bleed them, slow them, and test their resolve, because beyond this outer layer lay deeper rings manned by increasingly terrifying opponents, where transcendence would give way to monarchs, and monarchs to beings who brushed against divinity itself. The Chakravya was not meant to be breached quickly. It was meant to be endured. And yet, as the cult commanders observed the battlefield from elevated positions, as signals synchronized and final readiness confirmations flowed through the ranks, one truth became unmistakably clear to anyone watching from the livestream feeds or standing upon the stone itself. That the cult army was a force that had not just come to threaten, probe or seek negotiation, but rather was a war machine that had arrived knowing full well that every ring ahead would be bloodier than the last, and had decided, collectively and without hesitation, that it would tear through them anyway, layer by layer, no matter how many stood in its way, until it saved its dragon. Chapter 915 Grinding War. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. Commander Mickey James waited patiently for the cult engineers to finish assembling their war arrays, standing at the head of the vanguard with his spear embedded into the fractured stone, unmoving as artillery frames unfolded behind him and mana conduits locked one by one into the earth, because this moment was not meant to be rushed, and the cost of impatience here was bound to be paid for in blood. Only when the final synchronization glyphs flared across the command lattice did he draw his spear free and turn toward the countless ranks arrayed behind him, billions of cult warriors standing in disciplined silence as engines hummed, weapons were steadied, and anticipation simmered just beneath the surface. Cult warriors, Mickey James roared, his voice carried outward not just by amplification arrays, but by raw, unrestrained authority, rolling across the battlefield like thunder across open plains. This is the day you have all trained for your entire lives. His spear lifted, its tip aligning with the vast, curved arc of the Chakravua's outermost ring, where master-tier soldiers stood packed shoulder to shoulder, armor glowing faintly as formation sigils pulsed beneath their boots. This is the day your ancestors, and their ancestors before them, prayed to be a part of. A low growl rippled through the cult ranks, restrained, contained, but hungry. Today, Mickey continued, aura flaring outward as killing intent bled into every word, we bring the fight to the righteous scum. The sound that followed was not a cheer. It was a promise. Today, he bellowed, spear rising high, we make them pay. He drew in a breath, the battlefield seeming to tighten around him. On my three, we charge. Behind him, the war machines came alive, siege arrays locking into forward alignment as engineers fed final parameters into targeting matrices. On my three, the war machines rain hell on them. The sky itself seemed to darken as cannons angled forward. On my three, his voice dropped, heavy and absolute. We become immortals. A single heartbeat passed. 1. The cult army took its first synchronized step forward. 2. Mana surged through conduits, engines screamed to full output, weapons tightened in hands that had rehearsed this motion thousands of times. Go, go, go. The battlefield detonated into motion. Cult war machines unleashed their payloads in perfect synchronization, artillery fire screaming overhead as energy lances slammed into the Chakravua's outer ring, shattering formation sigils and tearing open dense blocks of defenders just as the infantry surged forward beneath the bombardment, billions charging as a single, cohesive wave rather than a chaotic flood. Boom, crash, shriek. The initial impact was overwhelming. Master-tier defenders barely had time to raise their shields before cult commanders crashed into them like a collapsing horizon, the cult army charging behind them with such precision and density that entire enemy regiments ceased to exist within seconds, erased under the compounded force of disciplined momentum and superior power. Commander Mickey James was at the very front. His spear swept outward in a blazing arc, aura condensing along its shaft as the weapon cleaved through space itself, the strike erasing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers in a single motion, bodies and armor disintegrating under the sheer density of power behind it as the stone beneath cracked and cratered outward. To his left, Commander Anderson Silva advanced with terrifying calm, his sword flashing as it cut through enemy lines at their structural weak points, severing command clusters and reinforcement corridors with surgical efficiency, every step he took opening controlled gaps that cult soldiers flowed through without breaking formation. Further along the battlefield, Commander Dupravel Nuna did not advance with the army at all. He vanished. And where he reappeared, devastation followed. Entire sections of the outer ring imploded as his presence rippled outward in violent bursts, assassinations blurring seamlessly into wide-area annihilation as he carved through rear ranks alone, destabilizing the Chakravu's alignment wherever he passed and forcing defenders to fracture their attention in futile attempts to respond to something they could neither track nor contain. For a brief, intoxicating stretch of time, it looked as though the cult army would simply carve straight through. But unfortunately for them, the Chakravya had never been designed to fall quickly. As the cult spearheads drove deeper, the formation's true nature revealed itself, the concentric rings tightening their invisible vice as pressure shifted sideways rather than inward, intact sections rotating and closing with grim precision until righteous soldiers began to pour in from multiple directions, surrounding the advancing cult forces on three sides and applying a suffocating choke instead of a frontal wall. What had started as a clean, decisive incision slowed as resistance thickened, momentum bleeding away under coordinated lateral assaults, until the advance no longer felt like a breakthrough at all, but a grinding struggle against a formation that refused to yield cleanly and demanded payment for every meter gained. The cult could advance, but only by widening the breach outward as much as inward, because every meter gained toward the center left their flanks exposed to fresh waves of defenders cycling in from adjacent arcs, master-tier soldiers flooding sideways into the gap with grim determination. The diagonal assault that had seemed so devastating moments earlier now became a liability. Cult units found themselves fighting forward and sideways at the same time, formations stretching under the strain as commanders were forced to constantly rebalance pressure, redirect forces, and rotate units to prevent encirclement. This was the Chakravu's cruelty. It did not seek to stop an invasion outright. It sought to slow it, to bleed it, to force attackers to pay for every step with time, stamina, and lives. And so the battle transformed. The initial avalanche gave way to a grinding war of attrition, each concentric segment refusing to collapse neatly, forcing the cult army to fully annihilate entire arcs before safely advancing deeper, because leaving even a fragment intact meant risking being cut off from behind. Yet even as the tempo slowed, the cult did not falter. War machines continued to assemble behind the advancing lines. Siege platforms anchoring themselves into the stone as artillery shifted fire patterns to support widening engagements rather than forward breakthroughs, while pilots above adjusted their bombing runs to disrupt lateral reinforcements instead of simply softening the path ahead. The cult army adapted in real time. Monarchs rotated between pressure points, Transcendents reinforced faltering flanks, Grandmasters led counter sweeps to collapse encircling forces, and Masters filled gaps with discipline. Precision, each unit knowing its role, each movement flowing into the next as though rehearsed for this exact scenario. Because it had been. They had trained for this. They had prepared for a formation designed to grind armies into dust. And still, they pushed. Every swing of a monarch-tier weapon erased tens of thousands of enemies. Every coordinated surge shattered another section of the ring. Slowly, methodically, relentlessly, the Chakravya demanded endurance. And the cult answered with it. As the battle settled into its brutal rhythm, one truth became unmistakably clear to every soul watching the livestream, to every soldier bleeding on the stone, and to every god observing from within the prison's heart. That the cult army had not come seeking a swift victory. They had come prepared for a war that would worsen with every step inward. And they had decided collectively and without hesitation, that no matter how many rings stood between them and their dragon, they would tear through every last one. Layer by layer, no matter the cost, until they eventually saved him. Chapter 916 Dumpy Unchained. Meanwhile, Dumpy's POV. While the other cult monarchs began their onslaught against the righteous faction, each carving open their own section of the battlefield and dragging their respective divisions forward through blood and fire, Dumpy did not join the charge straight away, not because the battle did not call to him, but because the moment he watched his Lord Father collapse behind the ring of landed ships, something older than hunger took hold of him and pinned his feet to the stone. It was not fear. Dumpy did not understand fear the way mortals did, and even less so on a battlefield where death was simply a currency to be spent. Yet what he felt as he stood guard outside the makeshift medical ship was closer to a cold, protective fixation, as though the entire universe had narrowed until only one thing mattered, the faint rhythm of Leo's breathing somewhere behind reinforced bulkheads, and the knowledge that if that rhythm stopped, nothing else in existence would remain worth living for. He could hear the war outside. Not in clear detail, not as individual screams or blades, but as a constant, distant pressure that vibrated through the stone like an endless drumbeat, artillery impacts rolling in waves, mana cannons releasing their shrieks across the sky, the Chakravua's lattice humming with that unnatural resonance that made even seasoned warriors feel like their bones were being listened to, and yet Dumpy stayed still, watching the sealed door to the treatment chamber as his claws flexed and released in slow cycles. It wasn't that he did not itch to participate in this war. If anything, the longer he waited, the more the hunger built inside him like a storm trapped behind glass, because there was no warrior in the cult who thirsted for enemy blood as much as him, not with the way his body was built for violence, not with the way his instincts begged him to leap, cleave, and melt everything in front of him, and yet every time that hunger tried to pull him toward the front line, his mind dragged it back with a single thought. Lord Father had fallen, and until Lord Father rose again, Dumpy would not move. Inside the ship, he could sense the healers failing one after another, even without seeing it, because each time a doctor tried to push their mana into Leo's body, the air outside seemed to tighten for half a second, as though something inside the chamber pulled at the world and then rejected it, leaving behind a faint, sickening drain that made the nearby soldiers breathe a little heavier. Minutes stretched. Not ordinary minutes. Battlefield minutes that could swallow thousands of lives, that could turn a flank into a graveyard before a messenger even finished running, and Dumpy stood through them all with his jaw clenched and his gaze unmoving, as if his stubborn refusal to blink could somehow force the universe to behave. Then the door finally opened. A senior battlefield doctor stumbled out, sweat clinging to his brow, his robe damp around the collar as though he had been dragged through a storm. And even through exhaustion, the man still flinched slightly when his eyes met Dumpy's, because standing that close to the cult's greatest beast was like standing near a weapon that was already half-swinging. Dumpy did not speak at first. He simply stared, his presence pressing down on the doctor without intention, as although he did not release any killing intent, the weight of his stare was enough to make the doctor feel nervous, as the doctor swallowed hard to force his voice to remain coherent. "Don't worry," the doctor said. Words rushed but clear, as he tried to keep his tone professional despite the tremor he couldn't hide. "The Lord will be all right, he just needs rest, and a lot of mana to recover." For a second, Dumpy did not understand the sentence. Not because the words were difficult, but because relief was something his body had forgotten how to process, and when it finally hit him, it didn't come out as celebration, it came out as a long, shaky breath that seemed to empty a pressure he had been holding since Leo first collapsed. "He will wake," Dumpy murmured, as if he needed to hear it spoken in his own voice to believe it. "Yes," the doctor answered quickly, nodding, eager to reassure him. "His consciousness is intact, his circuits are scorched, his reserves are beyond empty, but he is alive, and the worst of it has passed, so give us a few minutes and we will stabilize him properly." The doctor took a half-step back as he finished speaking, as though expecting Dumpy to erupt anyway, but Dumpy's expression only tightened, his eyes turning distant for a moment as the storm inside him shifted direction, because now that his Lord Father was not dying, there was no longer any reason for him to hold his anger back. There was only reason to punish. Dumpy lowered his head slightly, not in thanks, not in gratitude, but in a quiet vow, as he spoke without raising his voice, and yet every nearby cult soldier heard it as clearly as if it had been shouted. "Good," he said, the word heavy, as his gaze slid past the doctor and toward the battlefield beyond the ring of ships. where flashes of distant combat lit the horizon, then I can finally work. The doctor blinked, as if he wanted to say something else, but Dumpy was already turning away, stepping out into open stone where the air tasted of ash and mana discharge, as the ground trembled faintly beneath him from artillery impacts and the Chakravua's resonance. He rolled his shoulders once. And the air changed. Not dramatically at first, not like the sudden detonation of a monarch's aura, but like a slow tightening of reality around a living mass, as though space itself braced for what was about to happen. Crunch. Grind. Dumpy's muscles began to swell, his bones lengthening with a grinding, internal thunder that sounded like mountains shifting. Beneath the sea, his body widened from 4 feet to 14 in a breath. Then to 40. Then to 80. Then to 180, his limbs stretching into monstrous proportions as his torso thickened like a fortress being built from flesh, and with every pulse of growth, the wind around him bucked outward, flinging dust and broken stone in expanding rings. Cult soldiers nearby staggered back instinctively, boots scraping as the pressure of sheer mass displaced the air, while engineers assembling war machines paused mid-motion, heads turning as if pulled by gravity, because there were some presences that overrode even discipline. Dumpy continued growing. 200, 220, 250, until he rose high enough that the landed ships looked small beneath him, until his shadow spilled across the stone and swallowed entire battalions, until the horizon itself seemed to shrink as his enormous form towered over the battlefield like a judgment that had decided to become physical. Across his back, 3 swords lay strapped like relics, 2 of them gifted to him by Charles before he died, and as he reached behind himself with the casual ease of someone drawing a knife, he gripped 2 of them and pulled them free, the metal singing as it cleared its sheaths, the sound deep enough that it felt less like steel and more like a bell struck inside the bones of the world. ****. The righteous soldiers on the outermost ring saw him then. At first, they did not understand what they were looking at, because their minds tried to interpret him as a tower, as a ship, as a mirage, anything except what he truly was, and then the sun vanished behind his bulk, and realization struck them so hard that even shouting failed. For a moment, some dropped their shields without meaning to. Some forgot their formations. Some simply stared upward as their instinct screamed at them to run, and yet their feet remained rooted because their minds had forgotten how to move. Dumpy's eyes narrowed. He locked onto the section of the ring he wanted first, not randomly. Not based on where the fighting was loudest, but where the density of the righteous stabilizers was thickest, where the lattice beneath their feet pulsed most strongly, because if they had forced his Lord Father to bear that strain, then Dumpy would return it in a language they understood. "How dare you," he muttered, voice low enough that it should have been private, yet so large that it rolled across the battlefield like an approaching storm. "How dare you mongrels force my Lord Father to bear such unbelievable strain?" His grip tightened around the twin blades. His muscles flexed. "Because of you infidels," he continued, voice sharpening as something poisonous entered the calm, "he had to come here personally and fight." Dumpy lifted his chin slightly, eyes burning with something that was not rage in the human sense, but a cold, unshakable certainty of punishment. Because of you, he had to push himself beyond his limits and walk till he almost died. Because of you, I saw him faint for the first time in my life. And for that, I will never forgive you," Dumpy said at last, as he bent his knees and leapt, shattering the stone beneath him as the sky itself recoiled, his colossal form blotting out the sun mid-arc while the battlefield fell silent for a single, dreadful heartbeat, waiting for judgment to land. Chapter 917 Be Humble. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. Womb. Asterisk. The sound tore across the battlefield like reality itself had been ripped open, a concussive roar that cracked the air and sent shockwaves rippling through armor plates, siege arrays, and exposed stone alike, as Dumpy finally launched himself from the ground, his colossal body exploding upward in a single, overwhelming motion that made the earth recoil beneath him. For an instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the shadow fell. Dumpy's immense form rose above the battlefield, blotting out the warped sky as his ascent carried him higher and higher, twin blades clenched in his hands while the sheer displacement of air around his body generated violent pressure waves that staggered soldiers on both sides, cult and righteous alike, men bracing instinctively as if a natural disaster had decided to pass directly overhead. On the execution livestreams, the image struggled to keep up. Cameras jittered. Focus lagged. Scale became meaningless. What filled the frame was not a soldier, not a commander, not even a weapon, but a living calamity arcing across the heavens, a beast so large that the battlefield beneath him shrank into insignificance, trenches and formations reduced to patterns carved into stone. And as Dumpy reached the apex of his leap, something else happened. From his open mouth, carrying on the force of his movement, a thin spray of spittle scattered outward, glittering briefly as it caught the light, droplets flung wide by momentum rather than intent, as they drifted lazily for half a second before gravity reclaimed them. At first, no one reacted. The righteous soldiers were too busy staring upward, minds scrambling to process what they were seeing, formations stalling as discipline failed in the face of sheer impossibility, orders dying in throats as officers forgot the words they had spent lifetimes memorizing. Then the first droplet landed. It struck the crown of a helmet near the inner edge of the Chakravua's first ring. There was no explosion, no flash, just a sound, a soft, wet hiss, as the metal of the helmet began to bubble. Blub, bubble blub. The spittle tore straight through the metal, before scorching hair and skin alike, as the soldier beneath it screamed half a heartbeat later, hands flying up as the helmet melted into his skull, acid eating through enchanted steel as though it were wax, flesh dissolving beneath it in smoking rivulets that ran down his face and neck before he collapsed, shrieking until his voice cut out. The next droplets fell, and the realization spread. It was raining, acid raining, and it was already falling everywhere. Arg, it's corrosive. Hide, hide, hide. Don't let the acid mist touch you. The righteous soldiers screamed, as the droplets struck helmets, shoulders, backs, visors, and exposed joints, before pooling in armor seams and under shields, hissing and steaming as they burned through layers meant to withstand siege fire, soldiers howling as pain overtook training, men tripping over one another as they tried to flee a storm that did not fall evenly, but in scattered, merciless patterns that punished hesitation as much as movement. Shields became traps. Formations dissolved. The first ring of the Chakravia, so carefully structured to slow armies through attrition and discipline, turned into chaos as men screamed, clawed at themselves, or simply collapsed where they stood, armor smoking, flesh sloughing away under the corrosive downpour. And above them all, Dumpy began to descend. His massive body fell with the inevitability of a meteor, blades angled downward as though he were about to spear the world itself, the shadow of his form sweeping across the battlefield and silencing even the loudest artillery for a fraction of a second. Then he hit. Boom. Asterisk. The impact was not merely a crash, but a catastrophic event, stone erupting upward in a violent halo as a massive crater formed instantly beneath him, shockwaves flattening everything within range as if a god had slammed his fist into the ground, thousands of soldiers dying without ever understanding what had killed them, bodies crushed into the stone by raw force alone. Crash. FSHHHHH. Asterisk. The acid rain intensified. Sheets of it poured around the crater's rim, sizzling and steaming as it flowed across the ground, melting clustered formations, crawling into trenches, pooling where soldiers had nowhere left to run, as it turned the outermost ring into a dissolving nightmare of screams, smoke, and collapsing bodies. Men begged. Men tried to crawl. Men tried to pray. However, none of it mattered, as inside the crater, Dumpy straightened slowly, twin blades hanging at his sides as acid steamed off his shoulders in faint trails, his massive silhouette looming over the battlefield like a verdict that had finally been delivered. Across the war zone, cult soldiers who had been grinding forward, meter by meter, felt the resistance ahead of them collapse almost instantly, pressure vanishing as if a wall had been ripped away, and even without seeing him clearly, they understood what had just entered the field. Big Green. The cult's calamity. Their living siege weapon. In that single entrance, without orders needing revision or formations needing adjustment, the tide of the battle shifted violently, because although the Chakravua's outer ring had been designed to slow armies and bleed them through attrition, it was never meant to survive a monster that turned the sky itself into poison and the ground into a grave. Dumpy stood unmoving within the crater, blades in hand, shadow rolling outward from his massive form as the righteous soldiers nearest to him recoiled in terror, discipline finally shattering as fear overwhelmed doctrine. However, instead of sparing even a glance for the weaklings screaming and dissolving around his feet, Dumpy's gaze remained fixed far beyond them, locked onto the enemies closer to the heart of The Chakravya, where Monarch tier warriors hovered near the inner rings preparing long-range spells meant to strike him without ever coming close. How fucking strong is that ancient swamp frog? Aren't they supposed to be the most violent species in the universe? Not even the most experienced beast tamers dare to work with one, so how did the cult manage to tame this mad lad? It doesn't matter how they tamed him, another voice snapped, strained with urgency as mana surged around them. What matters is that we kill him as soon as possible. The righteous commanders spoke over one another as they channeled power, sigils igniting around their bodies while they began preparing their strongest spells, desperation bleeding through discipline as they realized that if left alone the damage that Dumpy could cause was immeasurable. They were not alone in this realization either, as across the inner arcs of the formation, rings of grandmasters and transcendents followed suit, millions upon millions of warriors lifting staffs, blades, and spears in grim unison, mana flooding the air as tens of millions of attacks were prepared simultaneously, all of them aimed toward the same towering figure standing amid melting stone and screaming men. Yet before even a single spell could be released, Dumpy calmly raised one of his swords to his lips and shushed them. The gesture was simple, almost dismissive, but in that same instant, his bloodline skill, mana nullification, activated, its effect rippling outward in absolute silence, as it smothered the battlefield as though a switch had been flipped, and all at once, every conjured spell collapsed before launch, mana dispersing uselessly into the air as even Monarch tier warriors found themselves unable to pool, channel, or shape mana-based spells in the slightest. The battlefield froze. Shish, Dumpy said softly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned formation, heavy with contempt. Patiently wait for your turn to die, mongrels. His eyes remained locked on the inner rings as he lowered the blade. Lord Dumpy will eventually get to you too. A pause. However, until then, know your role. And then, with a faint curl of his lip, and shut your mouth. Chapter 918 The Cult Mastermind. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Righteous Faction Citizens POV. Across the Righteous Faction worlds, Dumpy's entry was treated like a catastrophic event, as none of the Righteous Faction citizens quite expected to see something so devastating exist on the side of the cult. What is that? The question echoed across countless viewing halls, as the livestream frame struggled to convey scale, perspective, or meaning, the towering figure rising from the crater on the pit making everything else on the battlefield look suddenly small and fragile. That can't be a living thing, someone said quickly, almost pleading, as though saying it aloud might make it true. That's got to be a war construct, right? It's moving, another replied, voice hollow. That thing is breathing. FSSHHH. As acid steamed off Dumpy's shoulders and soldiers fled in disorganized terror beneath him, the silence that followed was not respectful, nor stunned into reverence, but broken and frantic, filled with overlapping reactions as minds scrambled to reframe what they were seeing into something manageable. In one crowded plaza, a man laughed once, sharp and brittle. Of course the cult would do this, he said too loudly, gesturing at the projection. Of course they'd bring out something obscene like that. His laughter didn't spread. Nearby, a woman pressed her hands together, eyes wide as Dumpy raised his blade and Monarch tier spell formations died mid-cast. Did he just stop them from using mana? She asked. He didn't dodge it. He didn't counter it. He just shut them down, someone finished quietly. Parents reacted quickly. Too quickly. In homes and private halls, adults pulled children closer, hands covering eyes that were already too curious, voices dropping into rehearsed certainty as fear leaked through their composure. You see that monster? A father said, pointing sharply at the screen as Dumpy stood amid melting stone and fleeing soldiers. That's what the cult really is. That's why they have to be wiped out, a mother added, nodding as if affirming a lesson long prepared. That's what happens when you let evil grow unchecked. A child frowned. But, aren't evil monsters supposed to die? Then why does he look like he's winning? The question hung uncomfortably in the air. No one answered immediately. As despite no one wanting to admit it out loud, across the Righteous Faction worlds, the outrage they felt at the situation began to begrudgingly mix with something far less acceptable. Horror sharpened by admiration they refused to name. If that thing is just one of the warriors fighting for the cult, someone murmured in a military viewing chamber, then what more do they have hidden? Screens across the universe continued to show the same image from different angles, none of them making it any easier to understand, as citizens watched formations collapse, doctrine fail, and an execution spiral into something far larger than anyone had prepared for. They had tuned in expecting justice. They were now watching calamity. And no amount of shouting, explaining, or labeling could fully drown out the quiet, creeping realization spreading through every crowd. That whatever the cult truly was, they had been underestimating it up till now. Meanwhile, on the administrative capital of the righteous faction, within the chief administrator's office. Slam. Asterisk. The sound of his fist striking the desk echoed far louder than it should have, a sharp, violent crack that made the thick wooden surface jump once under the impact, pens rattling, documents sliding as the chief administrator leaned forward with bared teeth, breath hissing through them as he shook his head slowly, as though denial itself might rewrite the reality that had just been placed before him. No, he muttered under his breath, not to the room, not to the trembling figures standing before him, but to the universe at large. No, this doesn't make sense. Across from him, two junior administrators stood rigid, backs straight yet shoulders visibly tense, hands clenched at their sides as though bracing for a blow, because the man behind that desk was not merely their superior, but one of the most powerful civilian figures in the righteous faction, and right now, he looked like a man watching the floor crumble beneath his feet. The chief administrator dragged a hand down his face, fingers lingering at his eyes for half a second too long before he slammed his palm down again, slower this time, heavier, the wood creaking softly in protest. Thud. Say it again, he said, voice low and tight. From the beginning. One of the juniors swallowed hard. Sir, he began, forcing the words out in a steady cadence despite the tremor in his voice. While the cult army is fully engaged on the pit, the Sioux clan initiated coordinated raids across multiple righteous-aligned systems. The administrator's jaw clenched. Raids, he repeated flatly. Yes, sir, the second junior continued quickly, stepping in before the silence could stretch any further. Quick strike operations. They are not carrying any heavy machinery with them that would signal occupation. Instead, they seem to be flying mostly empty carriers to take out as much loot as they can from the planets. How many? The administrator asked, already knowing he would not like the answer. 7 planets confirmed so far, the first replied. Loot operations are ongoing on all 7. Intelligence suggests they're prioritizing mana cores, military weapons, ancient relics, and high-value civilian assets. The administrator leaned back slowly, chair creaking beneath his weight as he stared at the ceiling above him, ornate patterns blurring together as his thoughts raced faster than his breathing, because he understood at this moment that these raids could not be coincidence. Alone. The Sioux clan must have planned for this in advance, which meant they were most likely coordinating with the cult. And this isn't even their full force, is it? He said quietly. No, sir, the second junior admitted. Based on fleet signatures and manpower estimates, this appears to be only a fraction of the Sioux clan's total strength. If the window remains open, more systems could be hit within the next few hours. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. The administrator exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening against the armrests as a bitter, almost hysterical laugh threatened to escape his throat and failed, because the shape of the disaster was finally becoming clear, and it was far worse than a battlefield loss. They had miscalculated. No, he had miscalculated. It had been his analysis, his projections, his insistence that the cult would retaliate directly, predictably, that had led to the redeployment of righteous forces, the stripping of garrisons from key interior worlds to reinforce what he had confidently declared would be the cult's primary strike zone following Vare's execution. They had prepared for a hammer. And instead, they were being bled by knives. The cult attacks the symbol, he murmured to himself, eyes unfocused. The Sioux clan guts the body. One of the juniors hesitated, then spoke, voice barely above a whisper. Sir, what are our orders? The administrator did not answer immediately. He stared upward still, mind spiraling through outcomes, through blame, through the cold, inescapable truth that no matter how this war ended, whether the righteous faction crushed the cult on the pit or failed spectacularly in front of the universe, someone would need a head to display. And that head would be his. Because it was under his authority that troops had been withdrawn. Under his signature that defense grids had been weakened. under his confidence that the Sioux clan had been deemed a secondary risk. "They're working together," he said at last, voice hollow. "Not formally, not openly, but in effect, they might as well be." The room seemed to shrink around him. The cult drew every eye to the pit, every fleet, every god, every camera, while the Sioux clan, those opportunistic snakes, slid their blades into exposed worlds and vanished before anyone could respond. Perfectly timed, perfectly cruel. His fingers curled into fists again, nails biting into his palms as anger finally broke through the fog of dread. There's someone inside the cult. Someone who masterminded this. And although I don't know who, what I do know is that this mastermind must be identified and removed, even if it's the last thing I do as chief administrator," he said, as he finally realized that someone within the cult had played him like a puppet, and it wasn't until it was too late that he finally saw a glimpse of this mastermind's true plan. Chapter 919A Plan. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. After Dumpy's arrival shattered the outermost ring of the Chakravia into screaming ruin, the war entered a different rhythm entirely, one defined not by resistance, but by inevitability, as Dumpy continued his advance through the collapsing first ring, his twin blades sweeping outward in vast, unrestrained arcs that carved through fleeing formations and shattered what little cohesion the righteous soldiers still possessed. Arghhh. No. Save me, Lord Caliph. The righteous forces screamed in panic, as each swing of Dumpy's sword erased thousands, not because he chased them, but because there was nowhere left to run. Stones split underfoot, bodies were flung aside like debris caught in a storm, and wherever Dumpy stepped, the ground cracked and buckled beneath the weight of his presence, acid still steaming faintly from his shoulders as his blades tore open corridors of annihilation through the ring's remains. Hundreds of thousands died in minutes. And then, just as suddenly as he had descended, Dumpy began to change. The air around him tightened again, though this time not in warning, but in retreat, as his massive form began to contract, his colossal frame folding inward with controlled precision rather than collapse, bones compressing, muscles condensing, sheer mass withdrawing back into itself like a tide being pulled away from shore. 200 feet became 100. 100 became 40. 40 became 15. Until at last, Dumpy stood no taller than a massive, broad-shouldered frog, roughly 15 feet in height, still monstrous by any reasonable standard, but no longer a living mountain blotting out the sky. It was not weakness. It was restraint. Maintaining his giant form was draining an enormous amount of energy, far more than Dumpy could afford to waste this early in a war that was clearly going to drag on, and so remaining at that size any longer would have been reckless rather than impressive. More than that, the mana nullification he had activated earlier was finally beginning to weaken, its absolute suppression fading little by little, which meant that before long, enemies would once again be able to attack him from range. Staying that tall when long-range spells were about to return would have made him an easy target, a massive silhouette begging to be hit. So he shrank. Not because the threat was gone, but because the timing demanded it. The enemy's ability to strike from afar would soon recover, but by then it would not matter. The damage to the first ring had already been done, and the battle had already tilted in the cult's favor. More than 60% of the Chakravua's first ring had been annihilated, not merely broken or pushed back, but erased as a functional layer, its structure shredded beyond immediate recovery as cult forces surged forward with renewed momentum. Men, advance in formation, leave no gaps as you chase those bastards down, Commander Mickey James said, as he led his unit down the left flank with brutal efficiency. At this critical juncture of the war, the cult did not rush just because they had the upper hand, but rather methodically dismantled enemy forces until the last fragments of the first ring fell apart, giving them a clear road to the second ring. Meanwhile, at the center of the Chakravia, Helmuth had long since stopped counting the exchanges, not because the battle lacked speed or intensity, but because numbers lost meaning once rhythm revealed itself, and for wars fought between gods, it was never the tally of blows that mattered, only the patterns they formed. Soren moved like a storm given intent. Not wild, not reckless, but deliberate, contained, every motion feeding seamlessly into the next as twin daggers carved arcs of inevitability through the air, his footwork compact, his posture disciplined, his killing intent steady and unbroken despite the ancient wound carved into his chest, origin metal fragments still buried deep within his flesh like a curse that refused to fade. Helmuth felt it every time their weapons met. The slightest hitch. The briefest delay. There. I see it now. His thoughts remained eerily calm even as his massive frame absorbed another violent clash, muscles tightening, stance rooted, eyes never drifting to the wider war or the spectacle unfolding beyond the formation, because none of that mattered while Soren stood in front of him. The wound limits him. Not overtly. Not enough to slow him. But enough to shape his instincts. Helmuth watched with ruthless focus as Soren slashed inward, rolled beneath a counterstrike, reversed his grip mid-motion, pivoted off his right foot, and struck again in one fluid sequence, never once committing to a full outward extension that would pull at the damaged side of his chest. He avoids full lateral stretches, Helmuth noted silently. Not because he can't make them, but because they sting at his chest. Psychological avoidance. Not physical incapacity. And that made it exploitable. Another exchange detonated between them, godly force rippling outward and warping the air as Helmuth's lips curled faintly, his attention sharpening rather than dulling. And that left foot. There it was again. A delay so small it bordered on theoretical. Not a limp. Not weakness. But caution. He compensates, Helmuth realized. He favors momentum over balance when resetting. Soren recovered through motion rather than stability, flowing back into offense instead of planting himself cleanly, which meant that if Helmuth could force him into an awkward extension on the wounded side, the entire rhythm could fracture for just long enough. If I force him to stretch outward on the injured side. Helmuth's gaze dipped briefly, tracking Soren's footwork as he feinted. High, dipped low, then rolled into another strike that skimmed across Helmuth's ribs. I can create an opening to disarm the first dagger. The thought formed cleanly. And was discarded just as fast. Not enough. Because Helmuth knew Soren, he knew the follow-up. The second dagger comes immediately. Low roll. Rising slash. Straight for my jaw. Helmuth adjusted his stance without conscious thought, mapping the angle, the timing, the cost, feeling it play out in his mind as clearly as if it had already happened. I trade one weapon for my head. Unacceptable. His mind continued to grind forward, layered and relentless even as his body absorbed punishment, because barbarism did not mean stupidity, and overwhelming strength did not preclude precision. But what if? The thought surfaced slowly, deliberately. What if I don't disarm him first? Helmuth's gaze sharpened. What if I force him to choose? What if the opening isn't created through pain, but through obligation? He allowed Soren to press him then, permitted shallow cuts to rake across his armor, felt the sting without reacting as his mind assembled the sequence step by step. Threatened the center. Not the blades. Force commitment. A feint to the chest. A compelled extension. A moment where Soren would have to engage with both hands to defend what he could not afford to lose. And then, Helmuth's massive fingers flexed. I clamped down. No finesse. No flourish. Just force. Both daggers caught. Head exposed. End it. His pulse quickened, not with rage, but with anticipation, as the path clarified in his mind, brutal and elegant in equal measure. Soren surged again, daggers flashing in lethal harmony, unaware that Helmuth's eyes no longer followed the blades themselves, but the space between them. The space where a god could die. And for the first time since their battle had begun, Helmuth smiled. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because he had found something better than strength. A plan. Chapter 920 Slipping slowly. Execution livestream continuation. The pit, Soren's POV. Clang ** clang. Push. Soren felt it first not as weakness, but as resistance, the kind that did not announce itself through pain or failure, but through a faint hesitation between intention and execution, as though his body had begun asking questions his mind did not have time to answer. At the start of this battle, that hesitation had not existed. Every command he issued had been met instantly, muscles responding with perfect obedience, daggers moving where he willed them to move before the thought had even fully formed, his body behaving like a sharpened instrument honed for exactly this kind of prolonged violence. However, now, almost an hour and a half into the fight, that sharpness was finally beginning to fray. It's happening, my weakened body is starting to revert to its original state. The realization did not come with panic, nor with despair, but with a cold, professional clarity, because although the degradation was still subtle, still far from obvious to anyone watching, to a warrior like him it was impossible to miss. A parry that landed a fraction later than intended, steel scraping instead of meeting cleanly, a pivot that required a corrective step afterward rather than flowing seamlessly into the next motion, a roll that finished just slightly wider than planned, forcing him to compensate with his shoulders instead of his hips. Nanoseconds, at best, meaningless in isolation, and yet, deadly in accumulation. Inhale. Soren's breath remained steady as he clashed with Helmuth again, twin daggers flashing upward to intercept a crushing downward blow, the impact sending shockwaves through his arms and into his chest, where the origin metal wound answered with its familiar, muted burn, a reminder that never truly faded no matter how long he fought. His body absorbed it, his will overrode it, but the cost continued to rise. Each exchange felt heavier than the last, not in terms of raw force, but in response, as though his muscles were beginning to lag behind his thoughts by the smallest imaginable margin, forcing him to push just a little harder to maintain the same output. Focus, he told himself, tightening his grip as he slipped beneath Helmuth's counter and carved a shallow line across his opponent's flank, the blade biting true even as his left foot planted half a heartbeat later than it should have. He corrected instantly. Helmuth noticed nothing. Yet, the longer the battle dragged on, the clearer the imbalance became, as Soren felt himself burning through his divine essence faster with every exchange, his reserves draining at a rate that made no allowances for pride or missed execution. Whereas Helmuth, contrary to his reputation, did not fight like a simple brute. He fought like a mountain that had learned how to think, every movement grounded, economical, brutally efficient, his massive frame absorbing punishment without panic or haste, eyes cold and calculating even as divine force warped the space around them. Soren circled, cut, reversed, rolled, struck again, forcing Helmuth to react rather than advance, keeping the battle contained within a narrow pocket of space where neither could fully unleash the kind of destruction that could decisively shift the tide of the battle. Yet even as he pressed, Soren could feel momentum slipping through his fingers, because while his own responses dulled by imperceptible degrees, Helmuth only seemed to grow sharper, more attuned, more dangerous the longer the fight continued. This isn't good, the brute is feeling me out. The thought surfaced without urgency, without panic, but with a quiet, professional concern, as he raised his daggers for another exchange. Clang! Soren slipped past a sweeping strike and countered with both daggers in a crossing arc aimed at Helmuth's chest, forcing the larger god to brace rather than pursue, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the rhythm returned, the familiar flow of combat snapping back into place as if his body remembered what it was meant to be. Then the delay crept back in. Subtle, insidious. His follow-up strike came a fraction slower, the angle just slightly off, forcing him to roll instead of pivot cleanly, the adjustment costing more energy than it should have. Damn it. The curse burned through him even as his expression remained impassive, because fighting while making these microscopic mistakes grated against everything he was. Glance. For the briefest instant, Soren let his awareness slip beyond the Chakravua's barrier, and what he saw made him release a slow, measured breath as the cult army advanced beyond the shattered remains of the first ring, their momentum intact, their formations tightening rather than faltering. They're right on time. The thought grounded him, a single concession allowed before he snapped his focus back to Helmuth. They'll make it here at this rate. Relief settled into his shoulders, faint but real, as hope burned through his lungs and steadied his core. The cult's advance meant his suffering here had purpose. That he was buying something tangible with every second he endured. For if he failed here, they died out there. I can't fail now, he told himself, lowering his stance as Helmuth surged again. Not now. He met the next blow head-on, daggers locking against Helmuth's weapon as power screamed between them, muscles burning as he redirected force instead of absorbing it, relying on momentum rather than strength, technique rather than brute dominance. And yet, the delay persisted. Still microscopic, still manageable, but no longer ignorable. His body felt less like a blade and more like a machine running without maintenance, each cycle introducing tiny inefficiencies that stacked silently beneath the surface, invisible to anyone who wasn't living inside the strain. Soren adjusted. He shortened his movements, tightened his strikes, avoided full extensions that tugged too sharply at the wound in his chest, not because he could not endure the pain, but because the reflexive flinch it triggered cost time he could no longer afford to lose. Helmuth pressed harder. The pressure increased. Soren matched it. Again. And again. Yet with every exchange, the distance between thought and motion stretched just enough to be dangerous, a widening gap that threatened to turn discipline into desperation if he ever lost control of it. What Soren did not realize was that Helmuth was no longer fighting on instinct alone. He did not see the way Helmuth's eyes tracked not his blades, but his recovery steps, the way his stance reset after each exchange, the minute compensations he made without realizing he was making them. He did not sense the moment Helmuth stopped testing strength and began mapping behavior. Soren fought to endure. Helmuth fought to understand. And somewhere within that difference, a sequence was being assembled, piece by piece, not through luck or rage, but through patience sharpened by brutality. Soren struck again, daggers flashing in disciplined harmony, his will forcing his body to keep pace even as it strained under the effort. Because as long as he held Helmuth here, as long as the heart of the Chakravia remained contested, his people would continue to advance. That was enough. It had to be. He could not afford to look inward any longer, could not afford to acknowledge how close he was to slipping further, because the moment he did, doubt would follow, and doubt was a luxury he had buried long ago. So Soren fought on, unaware that while he was buying time for the cult, time itself was being turned against him. As slowly but surely, Helmuth was reaching closer and closer to the answer he sought. Chapter 921 Trouble. 25 minutes later, Helmuth's POV. For 25 more minutes, Soren somehow managed to keep up what looked like peak performance, his movements still crisp enough, his timing still tight enough, that nothing about him outwardly betrayed the strain building beneath the surface, and for that entire stretch Helmuth continued to trade blows with him as though the balance between them had not shifted at all. Yet around the 2-hour mark since their fight had begun, the truth finally surfaced as Helmuth began to notice the evident loss in Soren's performance, as the cult god struggled more and more to produce the same output. He's slowing down, even though I haven't done anything significant, he's slowing down. The realization slid into Helmuth's mind with quiet certainty, and the moment it did, something predatory sharpened behind his eyes, his killing intent thickening like heat trapped beneath a closing lid as his focus narrowed completely onto the man in front of him. Another exchange rang out, daggers scraping against his axe, force screaming through the air, and Helmuth felt it again, the timing just barely off, the pressure a fraction lighter than it should have been. There it is, he thought as his breath slowed, his stance adjusting by a small margin as he changed what he planned to do next ever so slightly. I couldn't find an opening earlier, but if I can gain half a microsecond between his attacks now. The thought did not finish itself. It did not need to. The finishing sequence had already begun forming in his head as a chain, each motion building towards the next, each reaction accounted for, as his mind assembled the end of this battle with ruthless patience. A low chuckle escaped his throat. Then another. Ha, ha ha ha. The sound rolled out of him without restraint, thick with intent, the heat of his aura intensifying as it poured outward, dense enough that even Morris and Caliph, watching from close range, felt the pressure spike and instinctively sharpened their awareness. He's committing, Caliph realized, fingers tightening around the origin dagger at his side. He's going for the kill. Helmuth stepped in. His first strike came heavy and direct, the axe sweeping down in a brutal arc aimed straight for Soren's center, forcing an immediate response from the cult god, as Soren reacted on instinct, crossing both daggers to intercept, steel locking as sparks burst outward. Clang! Helmuth felt the delay. Tiny. There. He twisted his wrists mid-impact, letting the force slide, then snapped his shoulder forward, not to overpower, but to redirect, the axe head scraping along Soren's right dagger at a precise angle. Shing! The dagger slipped from Soren's grip, just slightly, as the excess pressure bent it away from his wrists in a way that the cult god did not want it to. Shit, Soren thought, as Helmuth followed without pause, pivoting his hips and driving his elbow forward, the motion compact and vicious, as it smashed into Soren's forearm at the exact moment his grip weakened. Whoosh! The dagger was torn free, the momentum of the elbow hit causing it to spin away as it vanished into the distance where Soren could not reach it. Clang clutter. The sound traveled crisp and clean through the interior of the Chakravia formation, as Soren reacted instantly, his second dagger flashing up to compensate, his body flowing into defense with practiced precision, but Helmuth was already there, his axe haft snapping upward as he stepped inside Soren's range, the shaft slamming against the remaining dagger and driving it wide. Clang! Steel rang. Soren twisted to recover, however, Helmuth did not allow it. The berserker god surged forward, shoulder crashing into Soren's chest, as the impact forced Soren into a full extension, a motion that he had avoided committing to for the entire fight. As the second he did, the origin metal wound answered with a sharp, involuntary hitch that cost him the instant he could no longer spare. Hitch! Helmuth's axe came around again. A brutal, horizontal sweep. The second dagger was knocked free, torn from Soren's hand and hurled aside as the force carried through, leaving Soren suddenly bare-handed and off balance for the first time since the battle had began. Wobble. Backstep. The universe seemed to narrow. Helmuth did not hesitate. He raised the axe high and brought it down in a third strike, a killing arc meant to split Soren from collarbone to waist, and Soren had no choice but to react with what remained to him. He crossed his arms. An X. Bare flesh meeting descending god steel, as Helmuth cleaved his wrists clean off. Splat. *SPRRR. The impact was immediate and absolute. Blackened blood burst outward in a violent spray, fragments of flesh spinning away as Soren staggered back with a sharp, involuntary gasp, severed hands falling toward the stone below. Pain flared. Divine. Searing. And then the regeneration began. Divine regeneration surged into action almost instantly, radiant energy flooding the ruined limbs as bone and muscle began to reform, tendons knitting, flesh crawling back into shape with terrifying speed. But speed was not instant. And Helmuth needed only microseconds. He stepped forward, lifting the axe again, its edge humming with power as he aimed not for Soren's chest this time, but for his head, fully aware that while his weapon could not end Soren permanently, it could prove that he won the battle against Soren fair and clean, establishing his dominance for once and for all. Gasp! Soren's eyes widened. For the first time in the battle, panic broke through his composure as he felt the gap, felt the window where his body could not yet answer his will, where his hands were still forming, still incomplete. Death stood directly in front of him. And behind Helmuth, Caliph moved. The origin dagger slid free of its sheath without a sound, his aura tightening as he prepared to strike the moment Helmuth's blow landed, the execution already unfolding in his mind. This was the end. This was the opening. And the universe seemed to lean in, waiting to see the end of the tyrant that had kept the cult safe for the past 2,250 years. Chapter 922 Chaos. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit. All 8 figures holding the core of the Chakravya formation intact gasped at once, as a moment that they never thought possible finally unfolded before them. Gasp. Soren lay incapacitated before Helmuth's blade in what seemed to be a sure-shot end to the fight. This is it. Kill him, Helmuth. Ruvasa screamed in joy, as Helmuth raised his axe, the weapon's edge catching the fractured light of the battlefield while its weight drew the air downward with it. For the countless eyes watching across the universe, the moment fractured. Their eyes still unable to process the exchange that was unfolding at its current speed, however, for the gods present, the moment slowed. While Helmuth stood as the obvious center of attention, looming above Soren with his axe poised to fall, their awareness split instantly toward 2 additional vectors of movement, both erupting into motion at the same time, both carrying intent sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Caliph moved first. A red intent line snapped into existence from his core, straight and unbroken, connecting his origin metal dagger to Soren's heart with terrifying clarity, his body surging forward as though space itself had bent to accommodate his will, every ounce of his focus locked onto his younger brother's chest. While, on the other hand, Morris followed an entirely different trajectory. He moved wide, loose, almost playful. A grin stretched across his face as he accelerated, eyes glittering with a kind of anticipation that had nothing to do with mercy or fear, his path curving toward the converging disaster like a man stepping into a carefully planned prank rather than a god entering a lethal collision. Downward motion. Helmuth's axe began its descent. The moment stretched thin. The blade cut downward through layers of pressure and sound, each fraction of its movement dragging reality along with it, and as the swing committed fully, Helmuth became aware of the change. The presence. 2 of them. Approaching fast. His awareness expanded sideways even as his body continued forward, instinct screaming as his eyes flicked sharply to the right. Side eye. His gaze caught Caliph mid-motion. However, much to his annoyance, the Eternal Sovereign never looked back at him. Caliph's eyes remained fixed on Soren's heart instead, pupils narrow, expression calm, resolved, as though Helmuth existed only as background noise in a plan already set in stone. He plans to kill Soren before me. The Berserker god realized, as rage surged through him, hot and violent, as the truth crystallized in his mind. This was meant to end by my hand. I told you to not interfere. Helmuth thought, as his grip tightened around his axe, muscles roaring as he attempted to adjust the angle of his swing to somehow block Caliph's attack. However, unfortunately for him, he found himself unable to change the trajectory of his swing, as given the short distance between his axe and Soren's neck, the momentum behind the axe seemed to betray him. It's too late, I can't block Caliph now even if I somehow pause the axe. Helmuth realized, as the weight of the committed strike pulled his axe downward with unstoppable force, his body locked into the execution arc he had chosen seconds earlier, as every fraction of his power seemed to be invested in the killing blow aimed at Soren's neck. Caliph had chosen the moment perfectly. The timing sliced between intention and consequence with surgical precision, a window so exact that Helmuth lacked the leverage to alter his course, his own commitment turning into a prison built by his strength. And so, Caliph closed the distance without obstruction. Step. This is the end for you, little brother, he said, voice steady, carrying through the distorted air as his blade aligned with Soren's heart, its tip glowing faintly as origin metal responded to intent. Soren saw everything. The descending axe, the approaching dagger, two deaths converging from opposite angles, one tearing through flesh and bone, the other piercing straight through the core of his existence. His breath caught in his throat. His heart clenched. Time slowed further, stretching each sensation into agony as realization settled heavy within him. So this is how it ends. The thought carried no drama, only exhaustion and bitter clarity. After everything, this is where I fall. Images flashed through his mind. The cult advancing. The rings breaking. The people who believed in him. I failed them. The space between Helmuth's blade and his neck vanished inch by inch, while Caliph's dagger aligned perfectly with his heart, too. Vectors of death harmonizing into inevitability. Then, impact exploded from the side. Morris arrived like a wrecking ball wrapped in laughter. The deceiver slammed into the collision point with reckless enthusiasm, his body crashing into Helmuth's flank and Soren's shoulder simultaneously, his grin wide and unrepentant as raw force tore through the convergence. The trajectory shattered. Helmuth's axe wrenched sideways, its edge carving through empty air, instead of flesh as his balance collapsed under the unexpected blow. Caliph's dagger skewed off course, the red intent line snapping as his arm was knocked wide, the blade missing Soren's heart by a screaming margin. As the three gods tangled together in a violent spiral, momentum scattering them across the fractured ground as shockwaves rippled outward from the collision point, stone splitting. Air detonating. Thud. Tumble roll. Soren was torn free from the killing axes by sheer chaos, his body flung aside as Morris's laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, echoing through the stunned silence that followed. For a single suspended instant, the universe held its breath. Execution had been moments away. Death had reached out with certainty. However, through unexpected interference born of madness and timing sharpened to a razor's edge, fate had been torn violently off its predestined path. What the fuck are you doing, Morris? Have you finally fucking lost your head, you spineless lying snake? Caliph snapped, his expression turning into one of pure disbelief, as he could not believe that he had the chance to end Soren so simply, and that his own ally had so stupidly taken it from him. Chapter 923 Implosion. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. What the fuck are you doing, Morris? Have you finally fucking lost your head? You spineless lying snake. Caliph snapped, his expression turning into one of pure disbelief as his eyes locked onto Morris. Disbelief hardening into something sharp and dangerous as the origin dagger in his hand tightened just enough to show that this interruption would not be forgotten. However, contrary to his expectations, Morris did not look apologetic in the slightest, and if anything, the deceiver laughed even harder at those words, his shoulders shaking as he slowly shook his head in something resembling pity rather than regret. Ha 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 ha. Morris chuckled openly as he shook his head, lifting a finger to point lazily toward Soren first, then Helmuth, and finally Caliph himself, as though the three of them were actors on a stage performing a joke that only he could understand. Slam! Tremble! The ground beneath the execution stage shuddered violently as Helmuth planted his foot into the fractured stone, raw force rippling outward as he raised his axe and pointed it directly at Caliph, his expression twisted into something feral and incandescent with rage. I told you, not to interfere in my battle, Caliph. So what part of, do not interfere, did you not understand, Helmuth demanded, his voice carrying enough pressure to make the air itself groan, his fury matching Caliph's own as the Eternal Sovereign finally shifted his gaze toward him, contempt flashing openly across his features. I already let you have your fun, Helmuth, this was the end of the battle. I saw an opening to kill Soren, and I took it. Because that's what we are here for. To put an end to the evil cult. Caliph replied coldly, his tone sharp with conviction as he turned his attention back toward the still chuckling Morris after delivering his justification, before cautiously sparing a glance toward Soren, who by now had fully regenerated his injuries and stood breathing heavily behind them. You're a fool, Eternal Sovereign. Morris interjected at that moment, his laughter fading into something calmer as he rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, and casually adjusted his hair so that it no longer floated unnaturally toward the sky, but rather settled back over his shoulders in carefully arranged locks. As you already know, I'm blessed with the ability, Eye of Fate. And with that ability, I saw that even if you stabbed your brother through the heart in what you believed was a sure-shot end to the fight, you still failed to finish it. Because your brother, stubborn fool that he is, clings to life just long enough for Helmuth to shove you aside in rage, giving Soren the opening he needs to deliver one last blow before his body finally gives out. A blow, meant to end your life. Morris explained smoothly, his words landing one after another as Caliph's pupils dilated, disbelief cutting through his fury like a blade. In 7 out of 10 outcomes, you die. The timeless assassin's best sons both dying on the same day. But let's just say I didn't particularly like those odds, so I altered that reality and ensured you didn't have to suffer such an ugly probability. Stacked against you, Morris continued, his tone almost conversational as Caliph instinctively examined the aura around his body, searching for deception, only to find none, the truth of those words pressing uncomfortably against his senses. So you can thank me for saving your life. And then you can start by apologizing for the insults you threw earlier. Because if you don't, I might genuinely feel tempted to side with Soren instead of you in this battle. Morris teased lightly, his grin widening as Caliph's brow twitched violently, a vein popping at his temple as fury surged back to the surface, though before he could respond, Helmuth cut in once more. Also, Eternal Sovereign, I don't particularly care whether you believe the topless snake's story or not. However, what I do care about, is the fact that you showed me a severe lack of respect. A few seconds ago, I was moments away from proving to the entire universe that I am a superior warrior to your brother. And if you don't show me the respect I deserve, then I have no issue proving that I am superior to you as well. Helmuth warned, his axe lowering just enough to signal genuine threat rather than empty warning as the atmosphere within the heart of the Chakravya formation thickened to an almost suffocating degree. The 3 pillars of the righteous faction stood locked in open hostility with one another, killing intent bleeding into the space between them, while behind them Soren panted quietly as he recovered his strength, this sudden break from relentless combat becoming the perfect respite he needed to steady his breath and replenish his fading energy. That was close, far too close. Soren thought, as he pulled out a new set of daggers from his inventory. Everything could have collapsed if that blade had pierced my heart. If even a fraction of a second had gone differently, and the fact that it came to that at all tells me more than I want to admit. Holding back against Helmuth was a mistake. I assumed I still understood the limits of his strength, assumed that the Berserker God was something I could measure, something I could manage with discipline and control, while clinging to the idea that I was still the warrior I once was. But I'm not. I'm no longer the prime version of myself that stood unchallenged at the peak, no longer the blade that could rely purely on instinct and reflex to carry me through prolonged combat without consequence. If I keep fighting like that man still exists, if I keep trusting reactions that arrive a fraction too late, then this battle will end with my corpse on the ground. Helmuth has already sensed it. Kalith almost exploited it. And next time, there won't be an interruption. If I want to see this through, if I want my people to survive what comes next, then I need to accept the truth of my position. I am the weaker fighter here. Which means I can't afford pride. I can't afford impatience. I can't afford to trade blows just to prove something that no longer matters. I need to slow this down. I need to choose my moments. And when the time finally comes, that is when I gamble everything. Soren concluded as he steadied his breathing, divine essence circulating more carefully through his battered body as his gaze lifted once more toward the three hostile gods before him. Fate had allowed him to endure what seemed to be certain death, however, surely there was not going to be a second chance for him if he repeated the same mistakes. He had to understand that he was no longer the warrior that he once wasn't. That if strength alone could no longer carry him through this battle, then survival had to be earned through judgment, restraint, and a patience forged from the knowledge that the next mistake, his or theirs, would decide everything. Chapter 924 The Truth. Meanwhile, the onlookers' POV. Vasa did not move. Her hands remained steady, fingers interlocked with the barrier lattice as divine energy flowed continuously from her core, maintaining the heart of the Chakravya even as chaos erupted within it, her expression composed for the universe while her mind reeled at what she had just witnessed. No. The word struck once, sharp and absolute, as she bit her tongue and barely restrained her urge to shout her lungs out. Morris, you fucking idiot, if both the brothers died, then US great clans would have become the new rulers of the universe. Why couldn't you just sit back and do nothing for once? She wondered, as she tried and failed again and again to restrain her fury, as she knew in her heart that a chance as good would never appear again. Similarly, Mu Shen, who was also biting his tongue by her side, felt the same thoughts flash through his mind, as he too acknowledged what a great missed opportunity this was. What a shame. The thought surfaced quietly, without heat or outward anger, as his eyes remained trained on the center of the Chakravya where certainty had slipped through their grasp at the very last moment. What a fucking shame, he thought again, as to him, this was not a rage-worthy moment, nor betrayal in the emotional sense, but confirmation, the final proof that Morris had always been an uncontrollable variable masquerading as an ally, a being who valued outcomes over allegiance and amusement over stability, and who had once again chosen unpredictability when order had been within reach. If both brothers had fallen there, he reasoned calmly, already recalculating consequences even as divine essence continued to pour from him without interruption, we all would have benefited immensely from his death, including him. The conclusion formed cleanly in his mind as he traced the chain of outcomes that would have followed, how the cult and the universal government would have collapsed inward without their pillars, how the great clans would have stepped forward not as conquerors, but as inevitabilities, filling the vacuum left behind and becoming rulers through absence rather than open war, while Morris and Helmuth got the opportunity to carve the rest of the universe into quiet, uncontested domains. But instead, Morris had chosen to preserve the imbalance. As if territory meant nothing to him. As if control itself bored him. As if the slow burn of chaos was preferable to ownership. Meanwhile, a short distance away, Raymond stood frozen in place, hands trembling faintly as Morris's words replayed themselves inside his mind with increasing clarity, each repetition forcing him to confront thoughts he had never allowed himself to linger on before. Uncle would have killed father too. The realization struck harder than fear. Because for a brief, shameful moment, the idea did not feel entirely horrifying. A future without Kalith meant freedom from a presence that had dominated every aspect of his existence, a life where every decision of his was no longer weighed against his father's shadow, where expectation, judgment, and inherited destiny might finally loosen their grip from his neck. Yet that same future terrified him just as deeply. Because Kalith, while a micromanager, was also his greatest shield. Without him, Raymond knew exactly what future awaited him, as at best he would be forced into slavery for the great clans or Morris. While at the worst he would be killed mercilessly. His father's survival protected him as much as it constrained him. And so relief and dread tangled together inside his chest, inseparable and equally sharp, as he watched Kalith still standing, still breathing, still defiant. I can't survive without my father yet, not until I become a god myself. Raymond realized, the thought leaving him hollow, as he realized just how dependent he was on his father, even at this advanced age. Meanwhile, Throughout the universe, commoners paw. Across countless worlds, the livestreams descended into stunned disbelief. People stared at their screens in silence, mouths half open, minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed, as an execution transformed into infighting, and gods who were meant to embody unity now stood divided in full view of the cosmos. Did Lord Morris just save the cult overlord Soren? No, that doesn't make sense. Why would he stop it? Whispers rippled through viewing halls, city plazas, private homes, and military chambers alike, confusion layering over fear as viewers replayed the moment again and again, searching for logic where instinct insisted there was none. At first, suspicion took root. Has Lord Morris defected to the dark side? Did he sell his soul to the cult? Is this some kind of deception? But as his explanation spread, as analysts and scholars began piecing together the logic behind Morris's actions, the unease did not fade, it deepened, because understanding the reasoning did nothing to soothe them. If anything, it made the moment feel worse. For watching the righteous faction's three central pillars turn on one another, revealing that they were neither unified nor aligned, but instead driven by different priorities, different egos, and entirely different visions of victory, shattered the commoners' understanding of the universe they believed in. For if the gods they revered could not agree even in a moment where certainty had seemed within reach, then what did that say about the future they claimed to be protecting? People shifted uneasily. Some felt anger. Some felt fear. Some felt something closer to their ground reality shattering. Because what they were watching was no longer a simple conflict between right and wrong, order and chaos, executioner and criminal. It was an implosion, a fracture made public. And as the feeds continued to show the aftermath, the arguments, the tension, and the living cult god who should have died but did not, a single thought spread quietly across the universe. What even is the real truth? Does the universe really run how we assume it does? Were we the fools all along? As the commoners finally began to see the gods for what they truly were. Chapter 925 Collective Decision. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit. The tension in the air refused to dissipate and instead clung to the heart of the Chakravya like a living thing, heavy and suffocating, as Morris stood with his arms crossed, weight settled casually on one leg, gaze fixed on Caliph with a look that hovered somewhere between amusement and appraisal, while Helmuth remained several paces away, his massive axe still angled toward the eternal sovereign, the blade lowered just enough to signal restraint rather than forgiveness. Neither of them looked pleased. The interruption lingered between them like a stain that refused to wash away, because from Helmuth's perspective, he had been denied his victory moment, and from Morris's it had been redirected, while Caliph stood at the center of their collective displeasure, feeling the pressure from both sides and finding it increasingly difficult to understand how either of them could miss what seemed obvious to him. Unbelievable. The thought ground through Caliph's mind as his jaw tightened, irritation bleeding into disbelief as he looked at the two gods standing opposite him. I'm working with moronic children. They treat this like it's a sport to enjoy. Like pride. Like some contest of dominance. When the reality is simple. If Soren is allowed room to breathe, all three of us could die. How can they fail to see that? The frustration sharpened as he replayed the sequence in his mind, the opening, the certainty, the moment where a single thrust could have ended everything cleanly, and the fact that he had been denied the chance still gnawed at him like an open wound. Yet even as his irritation swelled, Caliph knew better than to let it spill outward. Escalation here would achieve nothing. And so, despite every instinct screaming against it, he exhaled slowly and raised both arms, palms open, posture shifting deliberately into something defensive, as though conceding ground he did not believe he should have had to give up in the first place. Helmuth, he said, voice steady despite the tension coiled tight in his chest, it's not that I do not respect you. He paused briefly, letting the words settle rather than rush through them. Because I do. His eyes flicked to the axe, then back to Helmuth's face. But my decision to intervene had nothing to do with disrespect, but rather everything to do with priority, and that priority is the same one that brought us all here. Caliph's gaze hardened. I just want the cult sect master dead. That's it. The words came out flat, stripped of theatrics, stripped of justification beyond their own weight. If my actions offended you, he continued, tone dipping just slightly, then I apologize. The admission tasted bitter. It felt undeserved, yet he forced it out all the same. And as for you, Morris, Caliph added, turning his head just enough to acknowledge the deceiver without fully meeting his eyes, thank you for saving my life. The sentence sat uneasily in the air, burdened by 1,000 unspoken implications, but it was said nonetheless, and for a moment, silence followed. Nod. Helmuth's grip loosened. The axe lowered fully, its edge turning away from Caliph as the berserker god cracked his neck with a sharp roll of bone and sinew, shoulders rising and falling as he released a breath that sounded more like a growl than a sigh. Huff. Very well, Helmuth said at last, voice rough but controlled, the fury that had been boiling moments earlier settling into something heavier, denser, more focused. Stay out of my way this time. He shifted his stance, planting his feet with renewed solidity as his gaze drifted past Caliph, briefly locking onto Soren's position before returning. I'll let you stab your brother in the heart, that I swear. He promised, as Caliph felt something tighten painfully in his chest. But only after I take his head clean off first. The words landed with brutal finality, not as a threat but as a promise. Helmuth, you want to keep fighting him alone? Caliph asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice this time. You've already proven you're stronger. You've already broken him. He gestured faintly toward the battlefield beyond. Why not end this now? Why not let me and Morris step in so we can finish this quickly? As a team, Caliph asked, as Helmuth shook his head in denial immediately. No. The refusal came without hesitation. This is my fight, the berserker god said, voice dropping into something immovable. And a fight ends when the victor stands over the loser's corpse. He straightened, chest expanding as his presence surged. I beat him once, Helmuth continued. Given another chance, I'll beat him again. The certainty in his tone left no room for debate. Clap clap. Morris applauded lightly, slow and deliberate, his grin widening as he shifted his weight and uncrossed his arms just long enough to gesture between the two of them. I agree, the deceiver said, amusement threading through his voice as his eyes flicked from Helmuth to Caliph and back again. Helmuth should be allowed to finish what he started. Caliph's expression tightened. However, Morris continued smoothly, since we are on a time crunch. His gaze drifted outward, toward the distant movements of the cult army beyond the formation. I have a practical suggestion. He raised a finger. We let Helmuth continue fighting solo until the cult forces reach the penultimate monarch tier ring of the Chakravia, or until he wins. Another finger joined the first. If they never reach it, Helmuth can take as long as he likes, whether it be 1,000 years. A third finger followed. If they do reach it within the next hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, then that's when the arrangement ends. Morris's grin sharpened. One way or another, that's the endpoint, so we can ensure that the cult god doesn't walk out of this trap alive, and neither does his evil army. Morris suggested as the implication was clear. There would be no indefinite waiting. No endless duel. An event horizon had been set. And he had set it precisely in a way that gave Caliph no excuses to intervene prior to those conditions being met, which meant that the eternal sovereign had been rendered as a spectator once more. You conniving snake, Caliph cursed internally, recognizing the trap instantly, knowing full well that Morris had framed the condition in a way that forced compliance without appearing to do so. Yet outwardly, he said nothing. Arguing now would only fracture the fragile alignment they had just salvaged. And so Caliph turned to Helmuth and gave a slow, measured nod. That works for me, he said, even as tension coiled beneath his skin. Helmuth considered it for a moment. Then he nodded as well. Very well, the berserker god said, lifting his axe once more, posture realigning toward the battlefield ahead. Then I'll make sure that I finish it before that. The understanding settled between them, uneasy but functional. Forged not through trust, but necessity. The impasse had ended. The battle would continue. However, the tension did not fade but only thickened. All of them eagerly awaiting what was to unfold next. Chapter 926 Redemption War. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit. Clang. Clang. Parry. Steel met steel once more as Helmuth stepped forward without hesitation, the momentary impasse dissolving the instant his axe swung back into motion, the berserker god re-entering the rhythm of battle as though it had never been interrupted, power rolling off him in heavy waves as he pressed Soren immediately, intent clear in every step and every cut. Soren retreated with purpose. His movement carried no panic, no disarray, as his daggers shifted into a tighter pattern, their arcs shortening and drawing closer to his body, abandoning aggression entirely in favor of layered defense. Each incoming strike from Helmuth met with precise redirection. Controlled absorption, or calculated deflection that bled force away instead of answering it. Helmuth felt the change within the first few exchanges. Something was missing. The pressure. The response. He brought his axe down in a crushing diagonal strike, expecting the familiar contest of force, only for Soren to slide aside and catch the haft between crossed daggers, guiding the momentum past his shoulder as his feet shifted just enough to preserve distance without surrendering control. No counter came. No attempt to punish the opening. Only space. Only time. Helmuth's brow tightened as he pressed forward, chaining blows together with relentless intent, each swing designed to force Soren into error, to draw out the hesitation he had already exposed earlier. Yet Soren offered nothing in return, his movements stripped down to necessity, posture lowered, stance compact, every action focused on continuity rather than domination. The realization settled slowly. He's stalling. The irritation followed close behind as Helmuth widened his swings, power surging heavier through each arc as he attempted to drown Soren beneath volume alone. Yet the cult god refused to engage on those terms, giving ground by inches, never steps, his breathing measured, expression closed, his defense holding like a dam under rising water. Helmuth drove him backward, stone fracturing beneath their feet as pressure mounted and the battlefield shifted. Yet despite the aggression and the force behind it, the sense of inevitability Helmuth had felt earlier failed to return. Soren was no longer contesting exchanges. He was enduring them. Helmuth's eyes narrowed as he forced Soren toward the edge of the Chakravia barrier, watching him yield space with unsettling patience, every movement deliberate, every retreat measured. What are you waiting for? The thought lingered, unwelcome. Because Helmuth understood this much. A warrior did not abandon offense without reason. And Soren was not a warrior that would give up on the hope of victory so fast. Which meant that this restraint carried purpose. Calculation. A possible plan. And Helmuth did not like the idea that he was probably now playing this game on Soren's terms. Meanwhile, the cult army. To say that the cult army moved as a singular, disciplined unit was an understatement, as what surged forward toward the second ring of the Chakravia resembled less an army of individuals and more a living organism, each formation flowing into the next with seamless intent, ranks advancing and adjusting in perfect synchrony as though guided by a shared pulse rather than shouted commands. The second ring awaited them in silence and steel. Unlike the outer layer that had broken under shock and momentum, this ring stood firm, composed entirely of Grandmaster tier warriors of the righteous faction, veterans whose presence alone warped the battlefield with pressure, whose stances carried confidence earned through decades of survival and slaughter, and whose coordination transformed the ring into a grinding wall of lethal precision. The moment the cult forces collided with it, the difference was immediate. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every step forward demanded blood. Every exchange carried weight. Blades no longer passed through panicked ranks but met hardened defenses, techniques colliding with techniques, formations locking together as Grandmaster warriors countered each advance with ruthless efficiency, forcing the cult army to abandon speed in favor of endurance. Yet the cult did not buckle. They absorbed the pressure and held. For the soldiers pushing into the second ring, this was no longer merely an operation or a strategic advance, but a reckoning, a battle carved into their bones long before they had ever stepped onto this battlefield, fought for the pride stolen from them across generations, for ancestors erased from history, for names that had been silenced and banners that had been burned. And so they fought like men who had already decided the cost. Each inch was contested. Each fallen comrade hardened the resolve of those behind him. No one retreated. No one yielded ground. Blades dulled, armor cracked, formations bent, yet the cult army continued to press forward, discipline holding even as casualties mounted, soldiers stepping into gaps without hesitation, ranks closing with tactical precision as if loss itself had been accounted for long ago. Years of preparation revealed themselves here. Training that had seemed excessive, drills that had been repeated, until they stripped men of ego and fear alike, now bore fruit as legion commanders barked orders across the chaos, their voices cutting clean through the roar of battle. Third cohort, wedge left. The command rippled instantly. Shields shifted. Spear lines angled. What had been a flat advance twisted into a spearhead mid-charge. The formation tightening as it slammed into the flank of a Grandmaster unit that had overextended, the sudden pressure forcing the righteous warriors backward as their line fractured under. The unexpected angle. Rotate rear line forward, compress. The cult soldiers responded as one, fresh fighters surging into the breach while wounded units peeled back without disrupting momentum, the rotation so clean that the enemy barely had time to register the change before they were being driven back step by step. The tide shifted, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The second ring did not collapse under the initial assault, but slowly it began to bend. And as steel rang against steel and the battlefield churned beneath their feet, the cult army proved what years of preparation had forged them into, an army that did not rely on miracles or singular heroes, but on cohesion, adaptation, and an unyielding will to advance. This was their redemption war. And they intended to carve their way through every ring that stood between them and the end. Chapter 927 Dying for a Cause. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, a Common Cult Soldier's POV. Push men. Keep pushing. The Legion commander barked behind him, the words cutting through the chaos with the sharp authority of habit, yet the cult soldier barely registered them at all. I have no energy to push on anymore. Commander. The thought surfaced weakly, drained of urgency, drained of protest, and yet his body moved anyway, legs driving forward as if they no longer belonged to him, arms lifting and striking in time with the men on either side, muscle memory answering the command long before conscious thought could catch up. They pushed as one, each of them leaning into the advance like there was no tomorrow, shields locked, blades flashing, boots slipping against blood-soaked stone as the second ring pressed back against them with relentless force. And still, something felt wrong. His body carried no fire. No excited mana surge. The attack felt numb, as though the world had lost its sharpness, as though color itself had drained away and left only dull shapes and motion behind. The clang of steel no longer startled him. The screams barely registered. Even the pain had softened into something distant, muted, like it was happening to someone else. How much longer will I survive? The question rose unbidden as he fought, breath rasping through his chest, lungs burning with each inhale, and when he risked a glance to either side, the answer frightened him more than the question itself. Half of his unit was gone. Men who had stood beside him at the start, men whose armor he recognized without thinking, men whose voices had blended with his when the banners rose and the horns sounded were nowhere to be seen. There were no bodies, no goodbyes, just absence. Where is everyone? Where did they go? The thought echoed hollowly as his blade came up again on instinct, parrying an incoming strike, feet shifting to cover a gap that should never have been there. He remembered the beginning clearly. Commander Mickey James's fiery speech as he spoke of pride, of history, of reclaiming the cult's lost glory, and how his blood had burned then, how his spirit had surged as if courage itself had gained weight and mass. Back then, the war had felt loud, bright, almost simple. However, now, nearly 3 hours into the battle, that feeling felt like a memory from another lifetime. The war had become monotonous. Not easier. Never easier. Just constant. A relentless stream of motion that assaulted every sense until his mind stopped trying to keep up. Kill. Dodge. Cover the man to your left. Drag the wounded back when they fall. Step forward when the line advances. Obey commands because hesitation means death. There was no space between actions anymore, no room to think or feel, only the next movement, again and again, until the repetition wore grooves into his soul. His sword felt heavier. His arms trembled faintly. His legs burned. Each new swing came a fraction slower than the last, each step forward took more effort, as he felt a terrifying truth slowly settling into his bones. The enemy is not tiring the same way we are. He realized, as unlike the cult vanguard who kept pressing forward creating new openings, the defending righteous faction forces were all stationary and fresh, each line amongst them facing the enemy for the first time ever, as their movements remained fresh and crisp. Clang, slash, thud. Beside him, yet another cult soldier died, the man's eyes wide with relief rather than fear as he collapsed. As watching him die, the cult soldier felt an odd sense of envy. Rest well, brother, you have fought hard for our cause. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain, the cult soldier thought, as he wondered as to when it would be his Turn to finally rest. Surprisingly, the idea of death did not paralyze him anymore. Nor did it make him hesitate. It simply existed, walking beside him as closely as his shadow, present. In every breath, every clash, every heartbeat that continued despite everything screaming that it shouldn't. And yet, even knowing that death could be waiting just beyond the next strike, he did not stop. He fought. Not because the speeches still inspired him. Not because he felt brave. He fought because he genuinely believed in his core that even if he died here, it would not be in vain, that fighting for the dragon was a cause worth dying for. And hence, as the enemy blade finally did decapitate him, he did not feel fear or anxiety, only relief, as the world twisted violently and his vision dropped low across the battlefield, spinning past shattered shields, broken spears, and boots still charging forward, the stone beneath him slick with blood and mud as sound dulled into a distant hum. His severed sight caught his own body a moment later. Headless. Still upright. His sword arm completing one final swing out of habit before the weight of absence caught up, knees buckling as the body folded forward and collapsed into the churned ground among countless others. So, this is how it ends. The thought came softly, without bitterness, without regret, as darkness crept inward from the edges of his vision, the battlefield blurring into indistinct motion and color. He felt strangely light, free. No more weight in his limbs. No more commands to obey. No more need to push. 141. I killed 141 righteous bastards. He counted calmly, the number surfacing clearly despite everything else fading. It wasn't much, but I did my part. A faint smile tugged at his lips, unseen by anyone, because even as his vision dimmed completely, he knew the truth with absolute clarity. He had played his part. He had been one of the countless nameless blades that had pushed the cult forward inch by bloody inch. And for that, his life had meaning. And because of that, he had no complaints even as he made the ultimate sacrifice. Chapter 928 Leo's Absence. Execution Livestream Continuation. The Pit, Commander Anderson Silva's POV. Anderson Silva glanced down at the chronometer embedded into his vambrace, the faint glow of its runes cutting through smoke and drifting ash, and the moment the numbers registered properly in his mind, a tightness formed in his chest that had nothing to do with fatigue. They were 4 minutes behind schedule. The realization settled heavily as he continued moving, spear flashing as he cut down another righteous soldier without breaking stride, his mind already projecting forward, calculating consequences even as his body fought on instinct. We have already fallen behind schedule, and things are only going to get tougher from here on out. If we don't make up for lost time soon, then the whole plan may fall apart. Anderson thought, as he knew better than anyone else, just how time-sensitive and precise Leo's plan was. Every movement of the cult army had been calculated against resistance curves, casualty tolerance, stamina decay, in reaction windows within the chakravia, and falling behind now meant that later, when the pressure truly mounted, there would be nothing left to compensate with. We're pushing as hard as we can, Anderson thought as his grip tightened around his spear, muscles burning beneath his armor. But without the Lord at the front, this pace is never going to hold. He realized, as without Leo spearheading the advance as planned, the cult army simply did not have the firepower it needed to clear enemy lines fast enough. Although himself, Dumpy and the other commanders were trying their hardest to stay on track, as time went on, they only fell behind schedule, unable to keep up with Leo's high demands. Sigh. Anderson exhaled sharply before stepping into open ground, aura flaring as he planted his foot and twisted his torso, mana surging violently through the length of his weapon, as the spear screamed in response. Heaven-cleaving arc. Swoosh. The technique tore outward in a brutal sweep, compressed force screaming through air and stone alike as a vast crescent of destruction ripped across nearly 3 kilometers of enemy formations, disciplined lines buckling and breaking as bodies were hurled aside under the sudden violence. Advance. Anderson roared, his voice cutting cleanly through the battlefield as cult soldiers surged forward in unison, pouring into the opening with practiced efficiency and reclaiming ground that had felt impossibly distant only moments earlier. For a brief window, momentum returned. The army pushed forward in earnest, meters stacking into hundreds as the breach widened, and Anderson drove the advance personally, his spear never slowing as he struck again and again, forcing the opening to hold through sheer pressure and presence. He already knew it would not last. It never did. Within minutes, resistance surged back from multiple angles as Grandmaster units redeployed with brutal efficiency, flanking forces collapsing inward and sealing gaps with fresh formations that locked into place like interlocking blades. The corridor tightened. The advance lost its urgency. The grind returned. By the time the momentum finally bled away completely, the army had gained less than a kilometer. Anderson tore his spear free from a fallen enemy and turned back toward the line, surveying the battlefield once more as the weight of the delay settled heavily on his shoulders, pressing down with the quiet certainty that time, once lost, would demand its price. This is only the second ring, he thought grimly. And it already feels like this. His mind projected ahead. A third ring held by transcendence. A fourth guarded by monarchs. The difficulty would rise sharply with every layer, as concern crept into the edges of his resolve. Lord, where are you? The question lingered as he raised his spear again and stepped back into the fray, continuing to play his part because stopping meant collapse, because retreat meant annihilation, and because until Leo returned, the cult army had only its commanders to rely on. This is my moment to prove my worth. I cannot back down now, he thought, as he understood very well that until the Lord returned, he had to go above and beyond to fill the void that his absence created at the front. Meanwhile Su Pei, as a Su clan descendant, Su Pei never thought that the most important battle he would ever fight in his life would be for the cult. Yet such was his fate as he found himself standing on the pit today, fighting under the cult banner, not merely because he was bound to Leo Skyshard through a slave contract, but because years spent beside these soldiers had reshaped his sense of belonging. He had trained them, bled with them, watched them grow from scattered survivors into a disciplined force, and somewhere along that path, the line separating obligation from conviction had quietly vanished. He believed these people were his. He believed he was a part of the cult of ascension. And hence his fighting also reflected that belief. Unlike Anderson Silva, who carved paths at the vanguard, Su Pei stood where battles were decided without glory, commanding the shield legions that guarded the army's flanks and rear. His responsibility was containment, continuity, and survival, ensuring that no enemy force slipped around the edges to collapse the advance from behind. In war, encirclement meant extinction, and hence, he protected the cult army from being choked out. First unit, cover the left. Third unit, rotate the second unit out. The defensive lines shifted constantly under his direction, rotating shield walls, tightening spacing, redistributing exhausted units before fractures could form. If the flank breaks, the vanguard dies, Su Pei thought, the calculation cold and immediate. If the vanguard dies, the war ends here. Orders left his mouth in clipped bursts, carried by authority rather than volume, each command shaving disaster back by inches. Tighten formation. Rear line, rotate. Hold position. The shield warriors responded without hesitation, interlocking. Barriers moving as a single body, absorbing shock after shock as Grandmaster units pressed in from multiple angles, testing endurance rather than strength, seeking fatigue instead of weakness. Su Pei felt the pressure building with every passing minute. As while Anderson fought time with momentum, Su Pei fought time with restraint. Every second he held the line allowed the vanguard to advance further into the Chakravya, yet every delay compounded strain elsewhere, as he too realized that they were behind schedule. We're behind, he acknowledged grimly. And I don't have the luxury of clearing distance. His arms burned beneath his armor as he reinforced his strength. Again, channeling more mana into the shield walls despite the warning. Ache spreading through his muscles. Slash. Push. Enemy blades slammed against the wall in a steady rhythm, the impact rattling through his bones as he stepped forward to anchor a wavering segment personally, shield locking with those beside him as he absorbed the brunt of the assault. He did not think about personal survival. He thought about cohesion. He thought about the men who trusted him to keep them alive long enough for victory to matter. This is what the Lord entrusted me with, Su Pei thought as another wave crashed against his line. Holding. There was no spectacle in it. No decisive strike. Only discipline applied again and again, minute after minute, as he maintained the fragile shape of the cult army through sheer control and refusal to yield. If the army endured, it would be because the line never folded. And Su Pei had no intention of letting it fold. Not today. Not while his people still stood behind him. Chapter 929 Cult's Silent Pillars. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Dupraval Nunes POV. Just like Su Pei, Dupraval was also one of the cult commanders that Leo had enslaved by force, and just like Su Pei, Dupraval too had found his calling within the cult over time, as although he had joined the organization against his will, as the years passed it had replaced the place in his heart that was once occupied by the Black Serpents. Chink. Boom. A poison grenade detonated deep within the enemy's rear formation, viridian smoke erupting outward in a violent bloom as Dupraval slipped through the chaos like a shadow given intent, already moving before the screams began, his daggers low and loose in his hands as bodies started to fall choking. Cough cough gasp. He had infiltrated deep into the enemy lines alone, with no escort, no cover and no clear path to retreat. However, he wasn't worried, for he knew that this loneliness was exactly how he fought best. Unlike traditional warriors who could fight both solo or with a team, Dupraval was more of a specialist fighter who preferred moving through the battlefield in narrow corridors of opportunity, where his presence was only felt in the aftermath, in the sudden collapse of a unit that should not have collapsed, or in the collapse of a retreat line that was supposed to be secure. He struck from blind angles. A dagger flashing across a throat. Another sliding between armor plates. The kills were precise and economical, each motion measured, each withdrawal immediate, as Dupraval refused to linger longer than the span of a breath, his monarch tier perception mapping enemy responses in real time, tracking hesitation, fear, and overcorrection as carefully as any blade path. He did not slaughter for numbers. He slaughtered for disruption, as unlike the other cult commanders, he did not have an army under him, and hence, had nothing chaining him down. Boom asterisk boom asterisk boom. Another series of poison grenades arced from his hand, bouncing once, twice, before vanishing beneath a shield wall. As the smoke that followed swallowed the enemy unit whole, screams rising as soldiers staggered blindly into one another, formations disintegrating as captains shouted conflicting orders, unsure whether the threat was singular or legion-wide. "That's right baby, cower before me," he murmured, as the fear that the enemy felt because of his rogue movements was the whole point behind his fighting style. He did not fight for blood, but rather for mass hysteria, so that instead of watching the front, the enemy reflexively checked their flanks and rear, as the paranoia prevented their minds from getting a single second of rest. "The cult army is your enemy later, first you have to handle me," he muttered as he cut down a Grand Master captain who tried to rally the poisoned ranks, daggers crossing in a tight X before separating, one blade opening the throat while the other severed the spine, the body dropping without sound as Dupraval rolled through the falling corpse and vanished behind a collapsed barricade. Moments later, a Monarch tier AoE technique detonated. Dupraval planted his feet and drove mana through both daggers at once, carving twin arcs of condensed force that tore outward in widening crescents, ripping through clustered enemies in a violent sweep that crushed armor and pulverized bone across hundreds of meters, the sheer pressure flattening those who survived the initial impact. Kaboom! He did not stay to watch the aftermath. He never did. By the time enemy formations reacted, he was already gone, his aura suppressed to a whisper as he slipped through ruptured terrain and broken command lines, reappearing minutes later in a different sector entirely, repeating the process with surgical cruelty. Poison. Precision. Terror. He repeated again and again, until the back lines of the second ring started to turn on one another and began to attack anything they saw move, including their own allies. If they fear the darkness behind them, Dupraval thought calmly as he wiped blood from his blade while being crouched atop a pile of dead corpses, they will never commit fully to the light ahead. He thought, as he moved to disrupt yet another sector of enemies. Having the background of the Black Serpent's guildmaster, he had always been an individual who understood the stakes behind such a big war. However, it wasn't until he lost everything to the righteous faction, that he realized just how precious an organization like the cult was and just how important moments like these were for the future of the organization. The righteous faction is corrupt and scummy. The universe will be a better place with the cult in charge. And hence, even though I know that our odds of winning this war are very low, I want to play my part in trying to achieve that impossible dream, Dupraval thought, as he continued to fight as hard as his limbs allowed. Meanwhile Darnell Nuna. Back when the cult had first kidnapped him, Darnell had never imagined that one day he would stand as one of the cult's integral pillars, carrying a responsibility that stretched far beyond his own survival, because back then his feelings toward the organization had been simple, raw, and absolute. Hatred. He had wanted the cult erased, wanted Leo Skyshard annihilated, and in those early days, that desire had felt righteous, even necessary, as he clung to it like an anchor in a universe that had been violently overturned. Yet time had a way of grinding down convictions when they were forced to exist within reality, and as years passed under the cult's system, his hatred slowly gave way to something far more unsettling. Opportunity. Where others had hoarded power, the cult invested it. Where the righteous faction had exploited him, the cult had nurtured him. From a struggling master-tier warrior to a monarch who now shaped the battlefield through sheer presence alone, Darnell had been reforged through expectation, discipline, and a system that demanded results while rewarding growth without prejudice, and somewhere along that ascent, the cult had stopped feeling like a prison. It had become his home. THRUMM. The battlefield trembled beneath his boots as he stepped forward, eyes narrowing while he felt the strain creeping into the army's rhythm, the subtle drag that appeared when momentum began slipping just enough to be dangerous. We're behind schedule, he thought grimly, grip tightening around his blade as pressure settled into his bones. And we can't afford even a single minute. The absence was impossible to ignore. Leo should have been here, spearheading the advance, tearing rings apart with overwhelming force and dragging the army forward through inevitability alone. Yet he wasn't, and that absence pressed heavily against Darnell's awareness. Which meant the burden had to be shifted. I have to push harder, he resolved as his aura flared, and he stepped into the line without hesitation. I have to carve a path. Mana surged violently through his weapon as he swung, the slash tearing outward in a devastating arc as space itself buckled, compressed force ripping through enemy lines and collapsing bodies in swaths, armor splitting and formations unraveling beneath the impact. The opening appeared. Darnell did not pause to admire it. He drove straight through, presence crashing into the breach like a living siege engine as his unit surged after him, the line advancing by blood, momentum, and will alone. Until Leo returns, he thought as he cut down another enemy without slowing, the responsibility to lead falls on us. On the commanders who remained standing. On him. I am a cult commander, Darnell affirmed silently as his blade rose. Again, eyes fixed forward. And I will not let this army falter. The war demanded momentum, so he became momentum itself. Chapter 930 Meeting Destiny. Meanwhile, Leo. While unconscious, Leo experienced a phenomenon that felt a lot like a ghost dream in the sense that his awareness had been pulled away from his physical body and into a separate space altogether, leaving him conscious, aware, and able to think, while his connection to the real world felt distant and thin. He knew he was no longer where his body was. That much was clear. His form existed, yet it did not feel solid, his outline made of drifting mist rather than flesh, edges blurring and reforming as though this world did not require him to be fully defined, and when he moved, there was no weight to his steps, no resistance, as though his form had no mass at all. This sensation is strange, Leo thought, as he felt as though he had been pulled into a ghost dream. However, it wasn't a ghost dream for sure. There were no memories pressing into his mind, no inherited emotions dragging at his thoughts, no bloodline visions demanding his attention, and no feeling of being shown something against his will. The battlefield was gone, and with it the noise, the pressure, and the constant tension, as they were all instead replaced by a silence that felt wide and calm. Color stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky above him flowed in slow layers of color, bands of violet, gold, cyan, emerald, and rose drifting into one another without clear boundaries, like liquid light spread across an endless canvas, shifting gently as the colors overlapped over one another. Whereas beneath his feet lay water. A thin, perfectly still layer that never splashed when he stepped and was smooth enough to mirror the sky with flawless clarity, making it feel as though he was walking across a reflection rather than solid ground. Step ripple. Each step sent soft ripples outward. Small. Measured. The reflected colors bent and flowed with them, turning mundane movement into something mesmerizing. Where the hell am I? Leo wondered, as by now a clear premonition had settled in his chest that a dreamscape like this could not possibly mean anything simple. You're right, Leo Skyshard, the space you are currently standing in is for sure not simple. A gentle female voice entered his ears, calm and unhurried, as Leo immediately turned to face the source of the sound. Standing before him, cloaked in the same shifting rainbow colors as the sky above, was a beautiful lady whose face seemed to change slightly every second, her features flowing from one stunning woman to another as though she possessed no fixed appearance at all. Who is she? And how did she read my thoughts? Leo wondered, as the lady standing across from him smiled softly, then tugged at her rainbow-colored dress before giving him a courteous bow. Greetings, Leo Skyshard, I'm Irina, however, you may call me Lady Destiny. The lady replied, as Leo felt his pupils dilate sharply at the explanation. Did she just say, she's Destiny? He wondered, as disbelief began to coil tightly in his chest. The lady simply smiled in response, a calm, patient curve of the lips that carried neither urgency nor expectation, as she allowed the silence to stretch naturally, giving Leo the time he clearly needed to steady his thoughts and let the shock settle into something manageable, as only once his breathing evened out, did she finally speak again. Yes, I am Destiny, one of the two origin beings of this universe, alongside Karma, she said gently, her voice carrying the weight of truth without pressing down on him. You may think of me as an existence that stands a tier above the gods you are familiar with, she continued, unhurried. However, I possess no physical vessel, and because of that, this dreamscape is the only place where I can manifest before you. As she spoke, the water beneath Leo's feet rippled faintly, reflections bending and reforming in quiet acknowledgement of her words. I call this place the Land of Fate. Leo remained silent, his face frozen in a stunned expression as he listened, his mind struggling to properly anchor itself to the meaning of what he was hearing, as though any sudden movement or interruption might shatter the fragile clarity forming in front of him. He did not speak. And so, she continued. Only a very small number of individuals have ever been permitted to enter the Land of Fate, she said, eyes steady on his. With the last such opportunity being granted to your ancestor. Her smile deepened just slightly. The timeless assassin. The words struck him harder than anything before them. The timeless assassin was here as well. The thought echoed through his mind, sharp and disorienting, yet Leo held his tongue, instinctively sensing that interrupting her now would be a mistake, since whatever was to follow next would naturally carry far more weight than his questions. Just as you stand before me now. He once stood here before me as well. Anxious, uncertain, and unaware of how deeply this meeting would shape the path that followed. She paused again, allowing the truth to sink in before continuing. Of course, she said calmly, I did not summon you here for idle conversation, nor do I intend to keep you here longer than necessary. The reflections beneath them shimmered faintly as she folded her hands in front of her. However, the weight of what I intend to reveal cannot be understood without proper context, she explained. And so, I must speak around the reason you were brought here, instead of addressing it directly for now. She explained, as by now, Leo felt his composure returning, the initial shock of meeting Destiny herself fading into focus, as he straightened his posture and prepared himself for whatever came next. Nod. He gave her a small nod of approval, as Destiny smiled and continued. I assume, said softly, watching him closely, that you are aware of the cult's great prophecy. She asked, as Leo raised an eyebrow, uncertainty flickering across his expression, as he wondered whether she was referring to the same prophecy that predicted the rise of the next timeless assassin, or whether she was referring to something different. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.